get your coffee and find a seat. Thank you all for joining yesterday. We had some really wonderful presentations and looking forward to hearing some more presentations today. We're going to have 2 sessions with 7 talks, and then at the end of the day, we'll have an open discussion on interdisciplinary collaboration to close the symposium. Just as a reminder, our talks are about 20 minutes long on a 30-minute interval that allows us to have time for some questions in the transitions. And I'll ask again that we try to ask questions into a microphone so that people on the live stream are able to follow the questions in addition to the answers. If you are looking for the schedule, you can find it online. There's a QR code when you entered the room, so feel free to scan that to find the full schedule and the abstracts and bios for all of our presenters. Over lunch, Ito, Nima, and Luna have a VR demo that they're going to have set up in the conference room, so I hope you get the opportunity to listen and view that. And without further ado, I'm going to have my colleague, ISM Fellow Tyler Sampson, introduce the first talk.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tyler Sampson, a fellow in liturgical studies here at the Institute of Sacred Music, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first session this morning on acoustics of speech and voice. Our first presenter will be the Reverend Dr. John Wall, Professor Emeritus from North Carolina State University, from which he retired in 2023 as a professor of English literature. Professor Wall has published numerous books and articles, and beginning in the early 2000s, he assembled a team of actors, singers, architects, and acoustics engineers, along with digital modelers, to collaborate on the virtual John Donne and virtual St. Paul's Cathedral projects, which I believe we'll be hearing more about just now. So please welcome Professor Wall.
Thank you very much and for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. And I'm not quite sure how an English professor wound up spending time in the company of digital modelers and acoustic engineers, but it's been quite a journey, and one that I'm very, very glad to have participated in. My presentation today builds on work that we've done with digital, visual, and acoustic modeling tools to recreate the experience of worship and preaching in various sites in early modern London, chiefly in and around St. Paul's Cathedral during John Donne's tenure as Dean of the Cathedral from 1621 to 1631. Grouped together as the Virtual John Donne Project, our 4 websites recreate John Donne's Paul's Cross sermon for Gunpowder Day, November the 5th, 1622, delivered in Paul's churchyard, 2 hours long. 2 full days of worship inside St. Paul's Cathedral from the mid-1620s, with sermons by Donne and Bishop Lancelot Andrews, and the service of consecration and dedication for Trinity Chapel at London's Lincoln's Inn, held on May the 22nd, 1623. The websites that present to the world these projects provide resources for understanding worship in English cathedrals and parish churches in the early 17th century through experience rather than as the basis of contemplation and reflection. Chief among them are visual depiction of St. Paul's Cathedral around 1625 and well before it was destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666. These images are linked to oralized recordings of services appointed for use every day of the year, the divine services of morning prayer or matins and the evening prayer or evensong, as well as services appointed for a narrower range of days, the Great Litany appointed for Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, and Holy Communion appointed for Sundays and holy days. These services recreate 2 full days in St. Paul's Cathedral, an ordinary or ferial day, that is, a day that is not a Wednesday, Friday, Holy Day, or Sunday, specifically the Tuesday after the first Sunday in Advent in 1625, and a festival day, Easter Sunday in 1624. These services reflect in the choice of music, whether survivals of medieval chant or compositions by contemporary composers like Orlando Gibbons, Thomas Tallis, or St. Paul's own Adrian Batten, and differences in styles of performance that distinguish between a festival or special occasion in the life of Christian England and ordinary everyday occasions. My argument for today is for the value of adding the experience of the passage of time and studying the liturgical context of sermons and other religious events, other religious discourses that come down to us from the early modern period. We now receive the works of Donne, Richard Hooker, and other leaders of the English Reformation in hefty and handsomely bound volumes. While there is certainly gain from this, what is missing is the ephemerality of occasion and context, dimensions that were probably vastly more significant to their original participants than the kinds of reflection that we bring to it today. Donne's sermon, for example, Donne's sermon for Gunpowder Day in 1622 was not part of a regular preaching obligation for Dean Donne, but is the result of a specific request from King James I that he do so to defend the king's authority in conducting foreign policy. Over the last decade, the use of digital modeling has enabled those of us working on the various parts of the Virtual John Donne project to restore the specifics of performance, physical setting, and the passage of time to some of the occasion-specific texts that survive from the early modern period. Using digital humanities grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and here I always have to thank everyone in my audience. It is your taxpayers' money at work, and for which we are all of us involved in this project are deeply grateful. The grants supported the work of over 100 people, including actors, linguists, historians, musicians, graduate students in architecture and acoustic engineering, and many others, all contributing in large ways and small to our ability to recreate the experience of specific spaces and occasions otherwise lost to us. The following excerpt from a reconstruction of morning prayer are matins from Easter Sunday, 1624, which contains both spoken and sung parts of Easter matins that you will get to hear from 6 different listening positions, illustrate how the qualities of sound vary in volume and resonance from one physical location inside the cathedral to another. Would the folks in New Haven now play the clip, the Easter Matins Jump Around audio, video.
Wherefore we beseech him to grant us true repentance and his Holy Spirit, that those things may please him, which we do at this present, and that the rest of our life hereafter may be pure and holy, so that at the last we may come to his eternal joy, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
The kind of work displayed that you had just experienced is especially important because while the theological controversies of the 16th and 17th centuries were debated among the learned, to the vast majority of English folk, the Reformed Church of England was defined by the occasions of corporate liturgical and sacramental worship they participated in through public performances of the liturgical texts contained in the Book of Common Prayer. From its very first edition in 1549, the prayer book enabled and defined the religious life of England, bringing together what Thomas Cranmer refers to as many different uses or liturgical versions of the liturgical texts into one use, bringing the nation together in common worship, promoting, as Cranmer referred to it, wholesome doctrine and the advancement of godliness through the daily hearing of Holy Scripture and celebration of baptism and Holy Communion in the language of the people. The corporate experience of the prayer book services thus sought to unite the nation, forming a deeper and truer sense of corporate religious identity and giving the private events of folks' lives, from birth to marriage to death, a richer meaning through their linguistic and liturgical incorporation into the realm of English public life. Or, as church historian John Booty has put it in admittedly idealistic terms, in the parish churches and in the cathedrals, the nation was at prayer, the commonwealth was being realized, and God, in whose hands the destinies of all were lodged, was worshiped in spirit and in truth. Taken together, and in an age when the individual's relationship to God was becoming more and more central to Christian understanding, especially among the reformers, these rites emphasize the corporate and collective work of the church, since the formation of Christian identity, belief, and practice is here understood to be conducted in and through the public corporate worship of the church. This emphasis is visible especially in Thomas Cranmer's 1552 revision of the Book of Common Prayer, when he replaced the moment of the priest's elevation of the consecrated host with the distribution and reception of the consecrated elements of communion by the congregation. 16th and 17th century theological arguments about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist were inevitably shaped by efforts to distinguish the reformist position from that of Catholic tradition, that in the prayer of consecration said by the priest, the substance of the bread and wine were transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. In this understanding, Christ's presence is located physically at a moment in time, the end of the recitation of the words of institution, and in a particular place, in the hands of the celebrant as he raises the consecrated elements for adoration by the congregation, and as the work of one person, the consecrating priest, acting before an essentially passive congregation. Theological discourse about the meaning of this moment, static descriptive accounts of the real presence of Christ in the consecrated bread and wine, are descriptive of this moment alone among the long sequence of acts scripted by the text of the Mass. To use a theatrical metaphor, one which I think is appropriate since liturgical worship involves trained actors wearing distinctive clothing who play specific assigned roles in the enactment of a scripted event. In this tradition of worship, the priest is the performer, God is the prompter, and the congregation is the audience. Focusing on this moment, which, while it reflects a high doctrine of Eucharistic presence, the consecrated bread and wine are regarded as really and truly the body of Christ, also distances the event of which it is a part from the actual culmination of the story on which it is modeled. In Paul's version of the story, of course, Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, breaks the bread, and gives it to his followers with the instructions to take and eat. But by the late Middle Ages, a similarly high doctrine of human sinfulness had led to reception of the consecrated bread, but not the wine, by the laity. The reception of the bread and wine was an extremely rare occasion. Actual reception of the consecrated bread, but not the wine, by the laity required extensive lay preparation, codified in the rite of penance, involving personal confession of one's sins to a priest and the priest's proclamation of absolution. This distancing of the laity from active participation in the Mass culminated in a decree of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 that the laity were required to receive Holy Communion only once a year. In a sense, the elevation of the host by the consecrating priest for viewing by the congregation, accompanied by the ringing of bells to call the congregation's attention to what the celebrant was doing, came to be a substitute for the congregation's regular active participation in the Eucharistic feast. Those of us familiar with Eamon Duffy's classic study, The Stripping of the Altars, will surely remember his account of people moving around inside a church or even running from church to church, while priests were at multiple altars were fulfilling their obligation to celebrate the Mass every day, so that layfolk could see as many elevations of the consecrated host on a given day as was possible. The significance of Cranmer's deletion of the elevation of the consecrated bread and wine and his moving the congregation's reception of the consecrated bread to follow directly after the priest's recitation of the narrative of Jesus' Last Supper can now be more fully appreciated. Here, Cranmer clarifies for us that the rite enables the congregation to participate in communion with Christ, not simply by observing a representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary in the elevation of the consecrated host by the consecrating priest, but by participation through time, not concentrated around a particular moment, but through the passage of time in the entire action with the bread and wine, or as one of the late 16th century commentaries on the Church of England's Catechism put it, through bread and wine, together with the actions of blessing, breaking, distributing, and receiving, exercised in and about the same. Of course, in doing this 16th century commentator anticipated by 400 years the arguments of Gregory Dix in his classic study, The Shape of the Liturgy, during the liturgical movement of the mid-20th century, which led to dramatic changes in the expectations about the Mass or Holy Communion on the part of liturgically minded Christian communities. Cranmer's 1552 rite affirmatively locates the meaning of the Eucharistic celebration away from what is signified by the brief moment of elevating the consecrated host. Instead, it is to be found in the full process through time of priest and congregation as they jointly participate in the action of blessing, breaking, distributing, and receiving the bread and wine of communion. This understanding of the way Christ is present in the Eucharist has been aptly described by, by Christopher Irving as a transposition of a sense of real presence to that of real participation. In this view, it is through the work of the people of God, embodied in the priests and congregations' actions of blessing, breaking, distributing, and receiving, exercised in and about the same. The relationship between the bread and wine of communion and the congregation of participants is clarified, since both become the body of Christ for the body of Christ. The slide here shows the interior of a new church building newly constructed in the early 1620s, where one can see the altar as a table, and we still have the preservation of the distinction between the choir area and the nave area of the space inside the church. But nonetheless, the altar is clearly a table, and the arrangement of things suggests the importance of the complete action of consecration, not simply the moment of its completion. This understanding of the way Christ is present in the Eucharist has been described by Christopher Irving as a transposition of a sense of real presence to that of real participation. In this view, it is through the work of the people of God, embodied in the priests and congregations' actions of blessing, breaking, distributing, and receiving, the relationship between the bread and wine of communion and the congregation of participants is clarified, since both become the body of Christ for the body of Christ. Cranmer articulates his understanding of real participation in the prayers at the end of his communion service. Here, offering and sacrifice are understood in terms of corporate action. Or as Cranmer put it, here we offer and present unto thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls and bodies, to be a reasonable, holy, and lively sacrifice unto thee, humbly beseeching thee that all that which be partakers of this holy communion may be fulfilled with thy grace and heavenly benediction. Through a series of liturgical actions scripted by the prayer book text, the congregation becomes one body, both really and aspirationally for Cranmer, or as he puts it, thou dost vouchsafe to feed us who have duly received these holy mysteries with the spiritual food of the most precious body and blood of thy Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, and dost assure us thereby of thy favor and goodness towards us, and that we be very members in corporate and thy mystical body, which is the blessed company of all faithful people, and I'll be also heirs through hope of thine everlasting kingdom. Cranmer also abolished the need to go through the act of private confession and receiving of absolution for one's sins before receiving communion. Instead, he made as part of the communion service the rite of 1552, and it similarly in all subsequent versions of the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer. There is a public confession and receiving of absolution situated in the rite as corporate and public preparation for the celebration of Holy Communion and the congregation's receiving of the consecrated bread and wine. The virtual St. Paul's Cathedral project enables us to experience the rites of Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer as embodying a theology of the Eucharist, of Eucharistic meaning found not in a moment of time, but in an unfolding of events through time, participated in by clergy and laity who collaborate to reenact all the characters, roles, and events involved in the biblical account of Jesus' Last Supper with his followers. To continue our use of a theatrical metaphor, in this tradition of worship, the congregation is the performer, the priest is the prompter, and God is the audience. The virtual St. Paul's Cathedral project thus addresses issues raised by emerging fields of study and practice, such as digital archaeology, data visualization, historic acoustic reconstruction, recreation of soundscapes, material culture studies, historical geography, liturgical studies, and material religious studies. These fields seek to recover the experience of past time through integrating data about ephemeral and material events and practices into forms of presentation that enable students of the past to explore the changing past from multiple perspectives and in simultaneous narratives. The Cathedral Project also addresses ongoing issues in a number of traditional and developing academic disciplines. These include English Reformation history, where revisionist historians' emphasis on theological debates among church elites, including the faculties at Oxford and Cambridge, as well as their use of continental sources for defining the Reformed tradition, ignore the content and significance of daily worship in the nation's cathedrals and collegiate and parish churches. These fields also include the work of literary scholars who have sought to fit major writers like Donne and Herbert into preconceived understandings of one or another theological or spiritual tradition, rather than attend to the formative reception of worship and the reading of liturgical texts that structured the daily content of these writers' own devotional lives. The virtual cathedral project, however, provides us with new tools for research into these issues by enabling us to experience the rhythms of set texts and variable readings that defined and structured the hours of each day and the seasons of the church year. We're able to glimpse more fully the structuring experience provided by Cranmer's reinterpretation of liturgical worship. The context, for example, for Isaac Walton's account of George Herbert's daily practice of conducting his observation of the daily offices, and here I quote Isaac Walton. Mr. Herbert's own practice was to appear constantly twice every day at the church prayers in the chapel, strictly at the canonical hours of 10 and 4, joined by most of his parishioners. And some of the meaner sort of the parish would let their plows rest when Mr. Herbert's saints' bell rung to prayers, that they might also offer their devotions to God with him. Yet we know today, especially in the world of religious practice and devotion to the sacred, old habits do die hard. In spite of Cranmer's efforts to increase the frequency of layfolk receiving communion, the best the Church of England was able to achieve by the middle of the 17th century was to raise the number of times people were expected to receive communion from 1 time a year to 3 times a year. It would take 400 years and another liturgical revolution or two for it to become customary for Catholic layfolk to receive both the bread and wine of communion as part of their customary Sunday worship, and for Episcopalians in the United States and Anglican churches in other countries to have the communion service with reception of both the bread and wine as the main service on Sundays, instead of something that in my youth was known as morning prayer and sermon. But now, in most places, communion is the major service. With sermon is communion service is the major service on Sunday, with the reception of both the bread and wine. It is especially sobering to remember that the official Book of Common Prayer for the Church of England is still the one adopted by the Church in Parliament at the time of the restoration of the monarchy in 1662. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. We'll take a few minutes for questions. There's a lengthy lunch break, so if we go a little over, we'll be okay. I assure you.
John, this is Braxton. Thank you very much for the talk.
Hi, Braxton.
I'm wondering, for the parts of the simulation we heard where the congregation is reciting together, so were those multiple acoustic sources that are simulated throughout the volume of the church then?
They were assuming the voices are the voices of the dean and chapter of the cathedral, and the choir, plus observing the daily office for that Easter Sunday, and obviously people. There's very limited seating in the choir. Most of the people who came to hear the service would stand in the north or south aisles, which has a very different acoustic character. So the actors playing the dean and chapter of the cathedral in their stalls in the choir, they were actually the members of the choir of Jesus College, Cambridge, which provided the music for this project. But they were playing the role of the clergy assembled in the choir, and any guests who happened to have joined them on this Easter Sunday morning.
Okay, thank you.
Standing in the aisles, or as one of the pictures shows, moving forward to receive communion at the altar in the choir, east end of the choir. Other questions?
I'll take a question. So preaching becomes is sort of a major feature of the English Reformation, and sort of the emphasis on preaching. And listening to what was happening in the simulation, I'm just curious, there were places that it seemed very difficult the intelligibility of the sermon would have been difficult. How do you take account of that or factor that into thinking about
the Cathedral Project website includes the full list of services. The assumption of the 16th, 17th century Church of England is that worship on Sunday begins with morning prayer, and then you have the Great Litany, and then you have Holy Communion, and the sermon is located in the service of Holy Communion. And then the afternoon with evensong in the afternoon with the sermon tacked onto the end of it. The preacher at the morning service was appointed was either the Bishop of London or someone he appointed. The preacher at the afternoon service was the dean or someone he appointed. I think what happened was at some point that sequence that we recreate, the morning prayer, Great Litany, Holy Communion, gets broken up, and when I was growing up, the typical Sunday morning service was morning prayer and sermon, except on the first Sunday of the month when you got communion. That all changed with the appearance of new prayer books in the middle of the 20th century, and also the liturgical changes in the Roman Catholic Church after Vatican II. As I say, at some point, that sequence of services, which takes a long time to do, gets broken up, and sermon. Yes, there's certainly an emphasis on sermon, but I think what I'm trying to bring back into the conversation is the significance of the liturgical context of the sermon. I'm not sure that answers your question, but
maybe one more question if we have here in the room. All right, well, join me in thanking Professor Wall, and we'll.
Thank you all for your time and attention.
So, on to our second speaker this morning, Dr. Braxton Boren, Associate Professor of Audio Technology at the American University in Washington, D.C. At American, he teaches courses on room acoustics, computer simulation, digital signal processing, and the human auditory system. Further, he is himself a researcher in spatial audio and room acoustics. In his current work, he is researching historical simulation of acoustical performance spaces, as well as further research on noise and speech propagation. And we will continue with our theme of Protestant Reformation, and now to Zurich.
All right. Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm Braxton. Shashank, you already heard from yesterday, but he helped out with some of this, so I stuck him on the slide as well. I think we're green light? Green is go? Okay. So, ironic, given that I'm talking about speech intelligibility. Some people think I must be an excellent orator. I'm definitely not, but let me know if you can't hear me in the back. Be speaking about early Protestant church acoustics, Huldrych Zwingli, and the Zurich Grossmünster. And since we just heard about St. Paul's Church from John, I thought here we're at the Institute for Sacred Music. We'll start with a quote from St. Paul on prophecy from 1 Corinthians 14. Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone know what you are saying? You will just be speaking into the air. Undoubtedly, there are all sorts of languages in the world, yet none of them is without meaning. If then I do not grasp the meaning of what someone is saying, I am a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker is a foreigner to me. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. So let this be simmering in the back of your minds as we talk about some of the theological issues that are going to be coming up here. So to go back maybe one generation before Thomas Cranmer and some of the reforms in the Church of England, the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. Let's just review. I know you all straight out of history class, I'm sure you don't need it, but a big reason for the Protestant Reformation is a church. And boy, not just any church, but of course, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Let's think about this acoustically. It's the biggest church. It's a volume of about 500,000 cubic meters. And if you've ever read any of Francesco Martellota's marvelous papers analyzing the acoustics of St. Peter's, mid-frequency reverberation time, about 10 seconds. So I always tell my students, if you think it's confusing listening to me explain reverberation up on the whiteboard with all these equations right now, imagine you're listening to me explain reverberation and equations, and also everything I said for the last 10 seconds is also still hovering around in your ears. It doesn't necessarily improve the situation. And in agreement with me is none other than a particular monk named Martin Luther, who has a quote. He visits the church in 1511, 1512, comments on the way back, the church was fine for music, but its acoustic was not good for preaching. Yes, I think he's maybe understating it a little bit there, but yes, that tracks certainly. So this is pre-Reformation Luther, but of course 5 years later he will post his 95 Theses, and the Lutheran Reformation begins in Germany. Now, after that, you have a variety of other Reformed movements that start in different areas of Europe. So if you have trouble keeping track of all of the different branches of Protestant Christianity, let's just have a quick review here. So we have, roughly on a continuum here, we have like more conservative and more radical. But you have the Counter-Reformation, the people who stayed Catholic. They made some concessions. You know, we have the Council of Trent and other things that happened within the Catholic Church, but still basically holding to what they had been doing before. Then you have Luther, who is seen as a radical, is condemned as a heretic, excommunicated from the church, but he's actually much more conservative than most of the other reformers that come later in various ways, as we will see. So the Lutherans, mainly in Germany. Then we have the Reformed, or what are often called the Calvinists in the English-speaking world, for reasons we'll talk about, primarily starting in Switzerland and then going to other places such as the British Isles through various chains. Of course, Henry VIII was not really sure whether he was going to be Catholic or not. He kind of kept hedging back and forth. People like Thomas Cranmer wanted to be Reformed. And then later, Henry's daughter, Mary I, goes back to being Catholic, and all of the super Reformed people are suddenly either going to be killed or they hop out of town and end up going to Switzerland, which is how they become very Calvinist, and then, of course, come back later after Mary's death. And then we have, of course, in the most radical part, the so-called radical reformers, who we often call the Anabaptists, and you have traditions such as the Amish or the Mennonites come out of this, and what we call Baptists have something in common with that, but it's not exactly the same thing. That comes a little bit later in various countries. So with this as a sort of map of the different movements, what did they all think of each other in particular? Well, Luther himself, talking about the radical reformers, he had a quote here. He said, "One needs a more cautious, discreet spirit which attacks the accretion which threatens the temple without destroying the temple of God itself." Here he's talking about a metaphorical temple, of course, but it's also true for his thoughts on sort of physical, literal temples or churches themselves, and that Luther has a big picture of what he is trying to accomplish, but he's very okay with most of the other things that were already present in the church service. Luther was a very talented musician. He was a big fan of Josquin, and he famously wanted to keep a lot of that music within the church service. He also wanted to keep he was sort of indifferent to images and statuary and things like that, which were in the churches. So prior to the Protestant Reformation, the assumption was more or less that most of your congregation was illiterate. They would probably not be able to read. So you would need things like images. You'd have paintings, you'd have statues that would sort of tell the story in ways that the common people could understand, who could not read the Bible for themselves, and the Bible, of course, not even translated into the vernacular for the most part. So you needed the learned clergy who were able to speak Latin and read these languages. Now, a little bit later, but not very much later, another person who you may not have heard of, who is almost as seminal as Luther, but not quite, is named Huldrych Zwingli, and those are his dates up there. And he's an early Swiss reformer from the University of Basel and University of Vienna, and was heavily influenced by Erasmus, much like Luther was, the so-called Christian humanism movement, which was sort of a precursor to the Reformation. And he becomes the Leutpriester, or sort of the people's priest, at the Grossmünster in Zurich in 1519, so only 2 years after Martin Luther's 95 Theses. Zwingli starts, and he's already a little bit of a radical. He's sort of radicalized as kind of a radical pacifist at first, ironically, because one of the big issues for the Swiss Reformation, it starts out at sort of a backlash against the use of Swiss mercenary troops, the Swiss guards who still guard the Pope, for instance. This comes from a tradition of all these European countries being at war with each other and always wanting to hire Swiss people as their army because they didn't want to use their own people. And eventually the Swiss were getting pretty upset about this. And this is sort of the first radicalizing event for him, although not the last, as we will see. Ironically, he ends up getting killed in battle, starting as a pacifist, but killed in battle during a war with the Swiss Catholic cantons during an effort in 1531 to try to unite all of Switzerland under the Protestant banner, and several of the cantons that wished to remain Catholic did not want to do that, and Zwingli is killed. That's why you can see him here with a sword in his statue. So I want to say a little bit about the Grossmünster. You maybe saw this earlier in Tobias's slides from the University of Zurich there, still on the emblem of the university as he was telling me. This is very iconic. If you've been to Zurich or you've seen photos of Zurich, you've probably seen it right along the river there. Constructed between 1100 and 1220. It was the chief church of Zurich and the center of intellectual life in the 16th century. There was no university in Zurich at the time, so the priests and the clergy of the Grossmünster sort of constituted the main intellectual life of the city. And Zwingli served there as the chief pastor from 1519 to 1531. And then the other famous Swiss reformer, Heinrich Bullinger, succeeded him immediately afterwards, 1531 to 1575. Acoustically, we can say its volume is about 16,700 cubic meters. So not as big as St. Peter's, but still pretty big. So let me quickly take you through what is happening in the early Swiss Reformation. So the actual thing that brings all events to a head in Zurich is the hilariously named Affair of the Sausages, which maybe could only happen in Switzerland. It's Lent right now, and during Lent, Zwingli is at a friend's house, and his friend has his wife cook them all sausages, which they're not allowed to eat meat during Lent. And Zwingli, in line with sort of the sort of leading intellectual ideas of the Reformation, believes that this is an issue of personal conscience. He personally did not eat the sausages, but he said that people should be free to be able to eat sausages during Lent. But it causes a scandal. It becomes known. His friend is arrested and thrown in prison. And this sort of brings to a head. Zwingli sort of writes on his behalf and says, I didn't eat the sausages, but I think he should be allowed to eat the sausages. Strangely, this really causes a big problem within the church. So the Catholic bishop who's overseeing Zurich does not live in Zurich. He is sort of bringing Zwingli to heel and says, no, you've got to fall in line here. And Zwingli asks for an official disputation in which the Zurich City Council ends up ruling in his favor. And there's a very interesting history here of how the Reformation unfolds in Switzerland, in that you have, it's mountainous, it tends to be much more Republican. Each city is sort of ruled very democratically by a city council. And the city councils in various ways had already been sort of asserting their increased control over the church at a local level for 100 years before Zwingli gets here. So in certain ways, this is kind of events were set in place to allow for something like this to happen. So Zwingli is triumphant in this disputation, and the city council sort of gives him a lot of leeway. He founds the Prophesei, which is actually named for that passage in 1 Corinthians 14 that I quoted to you earlier, which is a sort of seminary which trained pastors, and also he has sort of the leading scholars in Switzerland that are going through the Bible and leads to his translation of the Bible. So Zwingli has a translation, and Luther has a translation of the Bible into the vernacular. And he shifted the preaching towards systemic sermons in the vernacular for the common people, much like what will happen, of course, in Lutheran Germany. In 1529, Zwingli and Luther meet together at the Colloquy of Marburg, trying to reach a consensus and trying to reunite their movements. But as we heard in John's talk, they were famously not able to agree on the nature of the Eucharist, and Zwingli was accused by Luther of trying to rationalize a mystery, which is interesting because that was a similar sort of argument that the Catholics were making toward Luther, of course. But depending on where you're seated on that continuum, to your left or your right, people might seem a little too rational or a little too mysterious. I guess. So coming out of this, the next sort of logical move, as a lot of people are becoming more literate and they start reading the Bible and reading passages like in 2 Kings 22, where King Josiah cleans the temple of the idols. People start to look up at the temple, or at the church, and see these statues, see these statues of the saints they're supposed to pray to, made of gold, and they think, that this is not right. We should take this gold and melt it down and give it to the poor, reading the words of the Gospels for themselves. And so this starts to happen, and this is called the iconoclasms, or the Bildersturm. When I was first reading German documentary sources, I kept coming across this word Bildersturm, and back then Google Translate did not know what to tell me it was, but eventually I figured it out. Iconoclasm, or a painting storm, something like that. So the Reformation was stemming from this greater literacy, access to scripture, and it began to disapprove the images in the worship space. So Andreas Karlstadt had started this in Wittenberg, calling for radical iconoclasm by the people if the magistrate would not comply. He sort of wanted direct action, sort of mob violence at any cost. Luther, when he returned to Wittenberg after being sort of imprisoned for a little while, Luther came back and overpowered Karlstadt, and that didn't happen as much in Wittenberg. But in Switzerland, this became much more popular, and Zwingli was strongly against images, but he also believed that the purity, the iconoclasm, should only be carried out by the magistrates and not by mobs. So after a few sporadic mob actions, the Zurich City Council eventually did rule to remove all images from the churches in 1524. And the Zurich churches were cleared of statues, paintings, murals, altar decorations, votive lamps, things we might say are acoustically sort of diffusing, things that tend to break up the sound and scatter it in a lot of different directions, but also cleared of tapestries, vestments, altar cloths, which might be more acoustically absorbent. Also, the carved choir stalls and the wooden rood screed in front of the chancel was removed, and the Grossmünster's organ was also removed. And the walls were whitewashed, and this leads to the characterization of Reformed church architecture as 4 bare walls and a sermon. And you'll see this quoted a lot of times, talking about both the Swiss churches and then the later Puritan churches in England and the UK, and then also, of course, the many Congregationalist churches in the United States as well. So the organ and choir stalls are removed at the Grossmünster in 1524. All music was removed from the worship service, focusing only on the spoken word through scripture and the sermon. So it has this kind of metaphysic of transcendence, the idea that because we have this truth about God, that should be enough for you. If you can understand that, you don't need these chains of manipulation of your emotions through the statues, through the music. You just need the understanding and of what God has done for you. And this ban on congregational singing remains during Bullinger's entire tenure at the Grossmünster. Later, following John Calvin's model, Calvin actually introduces congregational psalm singing, seeing that as very important in the Bible. So sort of a monophonic a cappella psalm singing was reintroduced in the 17th century, which would be a little bit more like plain chant as you would think about it. So the Grossmünster today is very much kept in terms of this original aesthetic. You can see a lot of these very bare walls where maybe there used to be diffusing material in various ways, but they've kept everything kind of as plain as possible. They have reintroduced some choir stalls down here just on either side of the chancel, so a little bit diffusing, but for the most part, this very plain Protestant aesthetic has remained. Now, these Reformation movements are trying to focus attention away from the appeal of the priest to God in the Mass. Famously in the Catholic Mass, the priest would actually turn his back on the congregation, and you can tell already that my voice sounds a little bit different when I'm turning my back on you. But the Reformers instead placed the sermon as the center of the worship service, with the speaker looking at you and actually ensuring a clear line of sight, actually from the priest to everyone in the congregation. They translated everything into the vernacular, so as a result, they also start to care more about speech intelligibility, because obviously for the parts that are in Latin, if you don't speak Latin, we don't care a lot about the speech intelligibility of the space. If in fact, I'm speaking a language that you don't know, the acoustic characteristics are only secondary at that point. but much less focus on music, depending on the tradition. The Lutherans retained a greater focus on music, the Reformed and the Anabaptists much less so. And so I'm interested in how the acoustics of Reformed churches contributed to their understanding of the worship service. Now, there was a study by Desarnau and Carvalho that found that Reformed churches generally had lower reverberation time and greater speech intelligibility than similar Catholic churches in the same region. That the Reformed churches would have, kind of smaller volumes overall and also more dense seating configurations. And I was interested in, would this trend hold for like a large Catholic church like the Grossmünster, which is converted and retrofitted to Reformed principles? So we took acoustic measurements in the church. The red letters are source positions, and the green numbers are receiver positions throughout the volume of the church. And in honor of Angela Farina, let's listen to one more sine sweep. So we have this series of combinations of listening to the sweep and the building's response to the sweep. Just quickly, I'll take you through some of the initial results. So reverberation time, mid-frequency is about 5.2 seconds. So, not as long as St. Peter's, but still pretty long. Roughly, pretty good precision, and you don't get a ton of variation in reverberation time. So looking at speech definition, or the D50 index, this is about 0.2 out of 1, so about 20% intelligible. This is what you would rate as extremely poor intelligibility if this were any sort of public space. If you were trying to build a new building like this or putting this through a PA system, they would not let you build it. It would not be considered safe. So not entirely good intelligibility in the empty church today. The C80 index for clarity index is -4 to -6, so not especially clear, but sort of at the lower end of what you might be able to get away with something like monophonic plain chant, something very kind of slow and simple, like the congregational psalm singing that gets introduced later, but still kind of a large standard deviation there as well. If you look at the early decay time, this is a parameter that's a little bit more position dependent, and especially looking at the standard deviation of early decay time, this is a way that we can often look at the total diffusion in the space, and it's a very large standard deviation of 0.5 to 0.8 seconds, which indicates poor diffusion in the space, as you might guess from all the things they took out. I was also interested in if there were any room modes that were problematic from when you reduce statuary and things like that. Are there modes that become problematic? And there are a few very low frequency modes, 25 hertz or 32 hertz. But again, when you're talking about only the human voice doesn't actually produce any energy at 25 hertz. So it's not something that would be perceptible at all. So just in general, the Grossmünster was a focal point for the Swiss Reformation, turning it toward preaching, away from music. The space itself has poor acoustics for speech, arguably better for the type of psalm singing which gets introduced later on. The removal of images may have worsened the sound diffusion in the space, but does not seem to have led to noticeable modal artifacts due to the large size of the church itself. And in the future, we'll be working on computer modeling, so trying to actually model it as it existed in Zwingli's time when there were a lot of changes from the state of the church today, and also looking at other Swiss and German Reformed churches. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Time for questions.
Pretty cool. The standard deviation is across positions. Just a minor point. I wasn't sure what you meant. The bars. What are they?
Across all source receiver combinations
right.
for EDT. Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I also skipped some slides where we zoom in a little bit more by source position, but I was running late, so I skipped it.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to know what it meant. So
yeah.
When you say 0.5 to 0.8 in clarity, that means...
No, of EDT, so 0.5 seconds to 0.8 seconds. And generally in a concert hall, you'd be looking for no more variation than like 0.05 seconds to 0.1 seconds for EDT. So it would be pretty poor sound diffusion compared to, obviously, a modern day performance
What were
space.
the good seats?
Well, so as always, if you're going to you have something with a really long reverberant tail, just being closer will give you a little bit more, direct sound strength. But strangely, I didn't get much chance to show you, but from where the pulpit is today, at least, you get a few seats up in the balcony that are actually have like higher clarity than seats on the floor because of their angle and their distance. If they're on the balcony on the same side as the pulpit. But that's not the same pulpit that would have existed in Zwingli's time, so we're going to have to do computer modeling, because his pulpit was actually on the top of the rood screen, so there's the rood screen of the chancel, and then his was on the top of the pulpit staring out into the people, so it would have been very different angle as well.
That was very interesting, thank you. I don't know if I caught this or if you didn't say, was the Grossminster used primarily as a parish church, so for daily services, or were we looking at more of like a space that was primarily occupied for particularly important like Easter, Christmas, Christian feast days?
No, it was, the main church of Zurich, so it had daily services as well. Before the Reformation, it also has, like many of these Catholic churches, it has sort of guild chapels as well. So there's an interesting history on which guilds went Protestant and which ones remained Catholic. Like the stonemasons and the carpenters all went Protestant, but the butchers all stayed Catholic and things like this. So you can look at different chapels and think like, oh, these people were kind of done with this, and other people wanted to stay in and with it, what they were doing as well.
So as a follow-up, do you have any sense of like the sort of range of occupation that could have been expected inside the church?
Yeah, well, Zurich was tiny then compared to today. It only had a population of about 5,000 people. But yeah, I think the occupation today is a little bit lower. They're not crammed full of seats as they could have been. But once the Reformation really gets going and the Grossminster is really seen as this center of intellectual life, it seems like it would have been more packed at times in some of the other churches. In Bern and Basel, when the Reformation comes to them, they're kind of looking to the Grossminster as kind of people are going to the Grossminster to hear Zwingli preach, and then Zwingli would go and visit their churches and sort of give them advice and things like that. So it does seem like it would have been probably, fairly packed, I think, on occasion. Yeah.
Hi, this was great. I'm curious, since we have this double whammy of an increased focus on the sermon during the Reformation and a church that's really bad for focusing on the sermon, do we find anything in the documentary archive during and maybe slightly after the Reformation where people comment about poor intelligibility?
I haven't found any in the Grossminster yet, but I'm going to keep looking. As I was telling Tobias, mein Deutsch ist sehr schlecht, so it's slow going, but I'm creeping through some chronicles of it as well. So if I find anything else, I'll let you know.
Got it. Thanks.
The Reformed churches in the Netherlands, which would, I think, be very similar in emphasis on speech,
yes.
And they have the large Gothic churches, and the pulpits there all have the canopy, the tester, and you've mentioned the position of the pulpit in the Grossminster, and I wonder if there's any evidence of having a reflecting service to help project the voice.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm trying to figure out about Zwingli's original pulpit. So I know where it was. I don't know if it had the sounding board or the tester above it. The one that's there today does have that, which does give you a strong early reflection downward toward people on the immediate floor around the pulpit area. But yeah, I've not been able to ascertain that for Zwingli's original one, so that's something I'm working on in the computer modeling.
Yeah, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I'm wondering, do you know Jean-Christophe Vallière, who worked in France on the Catholic sphere regarding later adaptations on the acoustic in terms of textiles, which have been introduced not only for festive, decorative reasons, but also to adapt the acoustics to music performance. And I'm wondering, since you've already investigated so many other Protestant churches, is there a discussion how to adapt? So you said, talked us about the Bildersturm and the iconoclasm, so they put that all out, but for acoustical reasons, to make the speeches more comprehensible? in terms of intelligibility?
I don't think they had an acoustic sense of that per se. I think in general they wanted things to be plain, and the plainness before God was seen as important, just in the same way that we just have a sermon. We're not going to have a lot of bells and whistles. I don't think they would have had the acoustical understanding that in certain ways maybe some of this would have been better for the sermon actually, given the space that we're in. Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of work on the churches in Venice with Deborah Howard, for instance, where we did model, the tapestries and trying to quantify the differences in reverberation time on the festive occasions. But the Protestants were all about getting rid of festive occasions. Every Sunday is exactly the same. They canceled Christmas. They just wanted, there's no special Easter. It's just the same thing that we had last week. You should be as happy as you were last week. So for that reason, they wouldn't have been a big fan of extra tapestries on festive occasions either. Yeah.
And have you also taken into account the acoustic impact of the people, the faithful, a couple of hundred, who, as you did for the Venice churches too?
Yeah, so that will come in the computer modeling process. I mean, it's not uncommon in a church like this. It's very large and very reflective that when you add a big congregation, human flesh is kind of like one of the most absorbent surfaces at a lot of the frequencies that our ears are the most sensitive to. So you can often have the reverberation time drop about in half, but you also lose a lot of sound energy from that extra absorption. So the intelligibility would be theoretically better in the presence of zero noise, but it depends on how well behaved your congregation is. If everyone's completely silent, as you guys are, then you'll all be able to hear it very well because you're all absorbing some of the late tail reverberation. But if you've got some kids, squirming in the back row, then all bets are off.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bourne.
Our next talk will be Dr. Elliot K, who's a researcher at the University of York. She's collaborated on a variety of national and international projects related to acoustic modeling and impulse response measurement of heritage sites. Before joining the University of York, she was a senior lecturer in music technology at the performing arts at the University of Wolverhampton. And please join me in welcoming our next speaker.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation by Elliot and the Institute of Sacred Music here. It's a great experience to be here and actually talk about our work and listen to your work as well. Thank you very much. Sorry. So I'm going to talk about the acoustics, audibility, and political culture in the House of Commons in 1800 to 1834, and I will explain why specifically we chose that specific period of time to do our study. This project was part of the Paschaziers project. It was a collaboration-funded project where the University of Sorbonne were working on the Notre Dame, and the University from Parma with Angelo Farina, who mentioned several times during the last 2 days, and his contribution into the subject is huge, and we had the sad news about his death this week. They were working in the Tindari Theatre in Sicily. So all of us, we had a specific heritage site to study, and we overlapped our knowledge there. Specifically, the UK team, we were working on the House of Commons on that period, and I'll go through the history, the background history of what was that space. So initially, it was a chapel in the Westminster Palace, a medieval chapel that it was used for royal liturgy music, and started built by Edward I, completed by his grandson Edward III, and later on, as a result of Reformation, it became the permanent House of Commons in 1548. So in order to keep this as from a medieval chapel to the House of Commons, we see here the layout was kept during the years. So from the first picture where we have the medieval chapel, the 3D, a virtual model of this space as it was, as we believe it was in the past. And here again in 1653 from this painting where we see the chapel, but now used as a debate space. And this is the modern house that you have seen on your TVs nowadays, but it's not the same space. It's not even in the same location where the Westminster Palace is, because it was actually destroyed by a fire again. So the common thing here, though, it was that they kept the layout of the stalls, the choir stalls that they were actually used for the medieval chapel, for the choir. They were kept for benches for the opposition and the MPs to talk opposite to each other, and they kept this layout over the centuries up to now, and for political and cultural reasons, they still using this specific layout of debating. So the space was destroyed in a fire in 1834, and you can actually see here the chapel after the fire. A day after the fire, you can actually even see the fire pumps still in action down here. And here is the chapel where everything, the interior of the House of Commons, had changed over the centuries, was totally destroyed. So there were several iterations during the centuries trying to make this space more suitable for debates. Obviously, from a chapel to speech intelligibility and performing debates, it was a big change. So they hired Sir Christopher Wren in 1691 to modernize the space. So what he did, he lowered down the ceilings, he added oak wainscot across the walls, paneling across all the walls, covering all the Gothic style of the chapel, all the paintings, all the sculptures. The chapel, I forgot to mention earlier, it was actually aimed to compete the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. So the chapel was very decorated. And so Wren, when he modernized the space, he used part of this chapel. As you can see, the red frame here. The blue frame is actually the initial boundaries of the chapel. And the House of Commons here on red by Wren, keeping all the decorations and all the paintings hidden behind this paneling. And here is what you see now after these changes. In 1706, there was the Action of Union where 45 Scottish MPs had joined the debate. So they had to find more space for this. So they hired again Sir Wren to add more spaces, more sitting areas for these new MPs. And what he did, it was to extend in the galleries a bit further in with additional support with columns, and further on to add additional people here. And then we have the Actions of Union, where 100 new MPs from Ireland joined after the Action of Union between Ireland and Great Britain. And then they gave the task to James White to renovate the space again, and actually trying to fit 100 more people in a very tiny space. So what he did, the solution he had to find, it was to go back to the original frame of the chapel, destroy the paintings, destroy the sculpture behind it, and make extra spaces between walls, between columns, between windows, covering some windows, additional galleries, and so on. But still the space was suffering from space, from air, it was poor in capacity, and some of the paintings demonstrate here what we actually perceive as a really poor condition to have these debates inside. Continuing then, here is a section of the Westminster Palace, focusing here on the chapel. So this is the chapel. I highlighted here again in blue, so how it was the medieval chapel. And then green is how Wren and White had it as a House of Commons, part of this chapel. And a significant part here, that's why we are focusing in that specific period of time, it's these funnels that you see on the roof. So because the space was overcrowded, it was many issues with acoustics, and I'll tell you more about it. There was a lot of issues with heating as well, with heat and smoke from the candles and poor atmospheric conditions in there. So they had introduced different versions over the years to try to bring the heat up to the ceiling. So they introduced 9 ventilation funnels. As you can actually go back further, you see here the funnels here covered with grills. So here in the section, you see 3 of them, and the middle one was a very interesting one. It was an octagonal space, an octagonal shape, where we have references, and we know now that from 1800 onwards, women were invited up there because they weren't allowed on the debates. They weren't allowed in the House of Commons, but they were allowed with tickets, elite women from the period, to go on the top of the chapel where the old ceiling of the chapel was, on the top of the House of Commons, to listen the debate of what was going on inside the funnel. So here we have the women putting their head among those small windows and trying to understand, listening the debates of what was going on. You can see here the people on the debates down there. And Lady Shelley, she describes the space as there were things like chimneys bringing air up. And she mentioned also the sound ascends so perfectly that with attention, not a word is lost. So very interesting, they could hear very good, apparently. Some references say the opposite. So that was the intriguing thing for us. We were trying to find out what actually not permitted women in the House of Commons, how well they could actually hear from the top of the House of Commons. We had a lot of evidence around. We had the architecture plans over the years, over the alterations of many changes. And we had also, we used information from editorial cartoons like these, or sketches, that give us information about the materials of the space, that they were like on the sitting materials, on the cushions, how the speaker's chair was built, how that propagated the sound. So we used information from as many sources as they were available to us, and of course with a lot of judging the information that we get from there. And we'll build then acoustic model, because the space doesn't exist. So we built an acoustic model in 2 different software based on all of this evidence to understand how the space performed as a debate space. The space was modeled before by Katrina Cooper, but it was the version of the model, it was how the space was with Wren's renovations, Wren's alterations. We wanted to expand the space, so it's a new model where the walls, it's a different dimension, a different space, really. And we built that based on White's alteration. So here is the space with the funnels you can see on the ceiling, with new sitting areas, new balconies, and so on, in 2 different software. So that helped us to verify our own decision of acoustic modeling. And we also use spaces not to calibrate, that's why I had that in quotes. It's not calibration of the model because it's not the same, but it was a guidance of spaces that they look like or they have been used as a debate space in the past. So, of course, we had to use the House of Commons measurements in situ from there. Convocation House and Divinity School from Oxford University, they were actually used in the English Civil War as a debate space. So it was interesting to us to understand how they use this space. Let's see how the speech intelligibility, how the acoustics in this space is performed. Holywell Music Room, it wasn't used for a debate, but the layout looked like what we were looking for our study. And this space, the York Guildhall Council Chamber, built actually 200 years later than the space that we are looking for, but the dimensions were extremely close, and the features, more or less, very close. We are missing the gallery. We don't have galleries on top. We don't have a slightly different shape of the space, but you understand, in such a small space, in 1800, they had to fit 660 people. So very crowded, indeed, and not very comfortable. An extremely valuable source for us, it was the committee reports in 1831 and 1833. They appointed a selected committee to examine architects from that period for their new proposals for a new house. They really couldn't go anymore with that space. So they were looking for proposals. So they asked a lot of architects We have reports of many, many pages of people defending their proposals, how they want the new House of Commons to be. And that was an extremely valuable source for us because we understood what was the problem with the current one. So it was also very interesting. The committee was keep asking the architects about the acoustics. They pay a lot of attention. Tell us about how you will fix the problems we currently have in the House of Commons. Protection of hearing is one of the most essential parts of the plan in contemplation, they say. And there were numerous occasions where they mentioned the very reverberant space, I'll keep on that, poor acoustic conditions, smoke and heat issues, limited room capacity, and background noise. And here I'll have a parenthesis explaining what is the background noise. So imagine a debate space where people were cheering, were making sounds, they were giving sounds of disapproval, they may even do animal sounds or schoolboy noises in a debate where actually everyone is talking about each other. Small chats on the different parts of the room, a lot of talks and speech that it wasn't actually the focus of the debate, but also it was a space where they had noise from the women on the top because it was just wood. They could actually hear everything that was going on the top. There was actually corridors with a lot of offices on the sides. There were a lot of action from there. And imagine we assume that a very open, a very stuffy space like that, they should have the doors open when it was very full house. So they had the smoking room opposite, the lobby on the ground floor. People were chatting, people rehearsing their debates and so on. So it must have brought a lot of background noise in the space. And also people trying to pass in those small alleys between the rows to go to their seats. That also caused some disruption. So here is the painting I showed you earlier. And Hayter actually gives us some clues in this. So you see here people chatting, people not paying attention of what was going on. Here is the speaker with the red. He's actually talking here, but actually people talking to each other. People were standing from the galleries trying to see what was going on underneath because they couldn't see and they couldn't probably hear. So we have a lot of clues in this picture, so let's try to find out how we can actually understand this in a more scientific way. So we had the information from those architects that they were examining these proposals, with some comments about the evaluation about the space. So poor acoustic conditions at the galleries due to the heat from human bodies, and Benjamin Weiss said, decreasing the elasticity of the atmospheric air and impeding the progress of sound, which probably nowadays we don't agree with this statement, but certainly they had a consideration about how sound was propagated and what was the problem there. Adam Lee said non-cis should be even have been added actually behind the speaker. Considerable portion of sound was carried away, that was their definition, sound was carried away by the air drafts to the place where the ventilation space was for women to hear better. So the sound escapes from below. That's interesting terminology that they use to describe how sound propagates in there. The fewer persons, the worse the hearing. So we gather all of this information, we adjust our models, and so our model now is not based on omnidirectional sources because now we are talking about speech. So we had to simulate voice with a directivity, orientation, because whenever I'm changing, as Braxton mentioned earlier, whenever I'm changing my orientation, the sound changes as well. So imagine a performer, we're talking to the speaker or talking to the opposition or talking to the galleries, it will change the impact of the space. Used raised voice as a sound pressure level as a reference, and use a background noise equivalent of modern life now as a modern halls, lobbies, public areas in hospitals. So we had two scenarios, a full house and half-occupied house. Let's compare a bit the full house and a half-full house space. So the reverberation time is very low. They mentioned it's very reverberant, but actually it wasn't. It's a small space full of people with wooden floors, wooden ceilings, wooden walls. So it wasn't reverberant, but it was poor acoustics. So that was the thing that they were actually trying to explain. So here is a full house and a half full house. In the half full house, we use the parameter here, the speech transition index, to describe and represent how the speech intelligibility was across the different locations. So the colors represent how bad or good were the speech intelligibility perceived in different locations. So red indicates bad, orange indicates poor, fair for yellow, green for good, excellent for green, for dark green. So it wasn't excellent for sure, and then depending on where the location of the speaker was, you could see that it was located around him. People near the speaker could actually hear him better, but depending on where the speaker is or where the orientation of his head is, for example, in this case, the speaker in the prime minister location nowadays, he is actually facing the speaker. Everything else is poor. So in the full house, the sound propagation is not even. It's not distributed evenly across the space and depends on the location of where the speaker is. In the half full house, everything was fair. Whatever scenario we had, it was poor, apologies. So whatever scenario we had, it wasn't a good speech space to represent the debate. So I have two examples here for the full house and the half full house, the same person, the same perceiver from the same speaker's chair as a source. The expert we are going to hear is my colleague talking in an anechoic chamber on making an expert from Henry Before from 1792 from the subject on trade, slave trades.
Show me a crime of any sort, and in the slave trade I will show you that crime in a state of tenfold aggravation. It
was probably fair, as you can probably say, and obviously you are listening this through speakers in a contemporary space as well. So the same speaker here, the same perception here.
Show me a crime of any sort, and in the slave trade I will show you that crime in a state of tenfold aggravation.
So I'm not sure how clearly you can hear the differences, but it has a significant difference in speech intelligibility. While reverberation, it doesn't change much, speech has an impact there. So in the full house, the scenarios that we are looking is the speaker's chair, the prime minister location nowadays, facing the opposition, facing at the back of the MPs on his shoulders, and facing the speaker, so facing back to the speaker. And here two more speakers on the sides and one underneath the galleries as well. So very briefly here to say a few points about some locations. Behind the speaker's chair, obviously the acoustics is masked, so they had poor intelligibility in these locations. On the sidewall galleries, indeed, it was poor speech intelligibility as well. Everything else varied. An interesting location is the reporters. The reporters that were located at the top of the galleries from here, and they were complaints that they couldn't hear, or they were reporting that the MPs weren't actually audible, their speech. So we can understand that because they didn't even have a direct sound. They couldn't see the speakers in most of the cases. So this is two examples where they can actually hear just about the speaker's chair and they can perceive that.
Show me a crime of any sort, and in the slave trade I will show you that crime in a state of tenfold aggravation.
And again, when a speaker is underneath those galleries, that they could not even see them, so there wasn't even a direct sound. So how they perceive it here.
Show me a crime of any sort, and in the slave trade I will show you that crime in a state of tenfold aggravation.
So indeed, the reporters weren't in a very beneficial location there, and everyone else, indeed, it depends on where is the location of the speaker and where is the location of where they are sitting actually makes a significant impact. And to conclude with the women's location, so the women's are actually on the funnel up here, and in all of the cases, they had a fair listening experience. So they were listening more or less the same from wherever the speaker was. So they probably had the best tickets. So we could hear an example.
Show me a crime of any sort, and in the slave trade I will show you that crime in a state of tenfold aggravation.
So just to conclude, poor speech and intelligibility, it was indeed a chapel changed to a space for speech and uneven distribution of the sound across the space, depending on the speaker's location, no direct sight or sound, and of course that had an impact. Some seats were better than others, women had better experience than others. They used, their architectures back then, they used a very interesting term acoustics, which is a historical now term where it explains back then, pre-Sabine period, that how echo and reflections work in the space. And these architectures, they use this expression to define the acoustics there. They had some understanding or some consideration about acoustics, but not a scientific understanding of the acoustics as we know nowadays. And for further interpretation now, all of these data now are hanging to historians, where they are going to interpret this further more, because imagine an MP being experienced of how the space performs, they may have a preferable space, seat, that they are going to perform better. They are going to explain their debates and their arguments better, or they are going to hide a bit more. So these are actually now places, locations that historians need to collaborate with what we have found and take this historical evidence a bit further. So that's from me. Thank you, and some further publications on this work. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
So who won, Acoustics or Odeon?
It's different. So what we did, it was actually, I did expect that because I'm always expecting this question. We had the same results. Acoustically, wow. They do change. The values of what we actually calibrate the two models, they were very close. How we perceive them is different because they are slightly different softwares, slightly different algorithms. Even they are based on geometric rays, they do have some changes of how they interpret scattering, for example. So they perceive different. We weren't about to say which one best, because we can't, first of all, compare with anything we have. Right. So we tried to make them similar, and we did based on the values, and that was...
The reason I ask is that at an Audio Engineering Society conference many years ago, they were competing loudspeaker measurement systems, and there was a bake-off. So the inventors of each one came in and measured the same loudspeaker from the same microphone, and all four got different results. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. It's our experience and guess, and based on so many other factors, actually, you can't... We hope for the best plausible scenario. We can't be accurate.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm curious, when it's half full, would they have only been on the floor, or are they evenly distributed between the floor and the galleries when half full?
They were evenly distributed. So if you see further in the squares in a full house, so we were actually estimating how many people per square meter were. So in this case, if I remember correct the values, for a full house we had one person for every 60 centimeters, and that was double or even more. So it was how spread across the space.
Yeah, so you're just switching out measured absorption coefficients for those surfaces in the computer model. Is there historical evidence about that? I almost wonder if they would rather be on the floor if there was room. Like if it was a half full, I'd rather be on the floor. I mean, like if I go into a theater and like I don't have to sit in the nosebleed section or something.
We don't have evidence on that.
Yeah.
We assume, and it was more about our own study. But that's a great point, actually, yes.
Well, I just wonder how it would change the approximation of a diffuse field, right? That if you have like more evenly spread absorption as opposed to a lot of absorption on the floor and less in the balconies,
yes,
maybe?
It could, but because it's such a small space, with a lot of absorption anyway, with people's heavy clothes and wool back then, it didn't make much difference from this to this.
Yeah.
So in other circumstances, I would say, yes, probably it will make a difference. In this one, not so much, I believe.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Join me in thanking our speaker, please.
Thank you.
Our last talk in the session is going to be by Dr. Sarah Beth Mullins, who recently completed her PhD at Sorbonne University, studying the oral heritage of Notre Dame. She takes a holistic approach to the study of the human experience of music and acoustics, integrating methodologies from acoustics, digital humanities, and heritage studies to explore how sound shaped the Notre Dame's cultural heritage across time. She's now an engineer at Treble Technologies, where she works in research and development for computational room acoustics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mullins.
Wow. Let's hope this works. I didn't test it beforehand. I want to start us off with a bit of historical perspective on what we'll be talking about today. Bear with me, it's a long quote, but I think you'll come on an emotional journey with me. The very service of the church is defiled in that before the face of the Lord, in the very sanctuary of sanctuaries, they, showing off, as it were, strive with the effeminate dalliance of wanton tones and musical phrasing to astound, enervate, and dwarf simple souls. Such indeed is the ease of running up or down the scale, such the dividing or doubling of the notes, and the repetitions of the phrases and their incorporation one by one. The high and the very high notes are so tempered with low or somewhat low that one's very ears lose the ability to discriminate. And the mind, soothed by such sweetness, no longer has power to pass judgment upon what it hears. When this type of music is carried to the extreme, it is more likely to stir lascivious sensations in the loins than devotion in the heart. This commentary was offered by John of Salisbury, the Bishop of Chartres, in reference to the development of a new musical style that was occurring in Paris at the time that he wrote this wonderful rant in 1159. So, we're going to talk about music practices in Notre Dame in the 12th to 14th centuries. Because there's a lot going on, I'm just going to give you a very brief rundown of architectural and musical practices. So Notre Dame, the cathedral that we know today, is the third church dedicated to the Virgin Mary to have been built on Ile de la Cité in the Seine in Paris. We know from the historical record as well as from archaeological traces that there have been multiple churches and an ongoing religious occupation at the site since at least the 5th century of the Common Era. And the Third Marian Cathedral, the one that we know and love today, we know began construction around 1163, and that construction continued on until 1350 when it reached a point of major architectural stasis. This floor plan in particular shows the outline of Our Lady, the modern day one, as well as remnants of archaeological digs that have been found either fully underneath the floor plan of the modern church or partially underneath the floor plan. Now, in that period of construction from 1163 to 1350, there was a musical style that was developing among the clergy who practiced in the cathedral. And this school, the style is known as the School of Notre Dame. I'm not a musicologist, so we're not going to get into too many of the details about this, but essentially this development paved the way for complex polyphonic performances. So like we saw with Jonathan Berger's very excellent presentation yesterday with sort of later polyphonic music, that was a development upon the rhythmic modes that were experimented with and founded in this time period. So we've got here a timeline, a reconstructed version of the Second Marian Cathedral, the church that preceded the one we know today, and then periods of major architectural change. So in 1182, roughly 1220, and then the final form in 1350. Superimposed on that, we have examples of the musical styles. So PC, or plain chant, was performed continuously at the cathedral throughout this time. We're going to listen to a quick sample of it here, just so we're all on the same page. So this was considered to be a typical part of every religious ceremony inside the cathedral, nothing special, what you would expect to hear at all times. To represent the musical style of the School of Notre Dame, we're using a piece by the composer Perrotin. It's called Wiederund Omnes. Again, I'm wading into dangerous territory with the musicologists in the audience because there is some ongoing debate about whether or not Wiederund Omnes is, in fact, the most representative of the style, but this is what we're going with for the sake of today. So as you can hear, it's a polyphonic. There are 4 unique voices performing, and it's a significant increase in the rhythmic and melodic complexity of the music. And then finally, later on, as the 14th century is getting underway, we begin to see expansions upon this Notre Dame school of organum into religious motets, which have even more independence, more rhythmic complexity, etc. So, both of these bits of historical context have raised a question in the minds of musicologists since at least the 20th century. And that question is, there seems to be a bit of a parallel here between the changes in the architecture and the changes to the music. Now, Craig Wright, in a very seminal work published in 1989, hypothesized that the changes to the acoustics, due to the changes to the architecture, were in some ways connected to the development of this musical style. At the time, we didn't have the capacity to go back and test this hypothesis through any level of computational simulations. So he hypothesized it. It became relatively well accepted as a likely hypothesis, and it was sort of dropped by the community as of course, the field moved on. However, fast forward to 2019 and the fire and a renewed interest in the acoustic heritage of the cathedral, we now have the computational ability to go back and test these questions and these theories of Craig Wright and his colleagues. So the main work of this is essentially to look at 2 different dimensions as they travel through time. So, of course, we want to look at the objective metrics, like talking about reverberation time in ways that we as a modern audience can understand. But also we need to consider the fact that there are subjective experiences of acoustics that extend beyond an RT time or a clarity metric. And I'm going to take the opportunity here just to point out that when we talk about subjective metrics, we can actually split it into two more subcategories. I think as researchers of acoustic heritage, we tend to put ourselves in the mindset of an observer whenever we begin to consider cultural heritage, musical heritages that spring up in a particular place. We are scientists always, even in our historical analysis. But in fact, there are two different experiences, at least, of these heritage spaces. There's the experience of the person who is creating the culture in the space, and there's the experience of the person who is listening to the culture in this space. So in order to understand the subjective metrics and the subjective experience of people in the cathedral at this time, my work looked at both singing experiments, the way music culture creators might have interacted with the acoustics, as well as the observer role, the way the bishop and the other members of the church chapter would have perceived and experienced the performances of the singer. So let's do a quick blitz through the development of the acoustical models, which were aimed at the question of understanding how the acoustics were changing inside the changing building. So for the purposes of this study, I developed a series of models based at key architectural moments in time. So in this case, we're calling 1163 the Second Marian Cathedral, which based off of the archaeological remnants discovered under the cathedral was likely built in a Roman basilica style. It had 5 aisles, and that's about all we know about it, to be honest. We have archival information from 1182 attesting that the bishop was attending a service sat in the wrong seat inside Cathedral number 3. So that corresponds to our little baby Notre Dame. And then we are speeding through history and looking at points where the nave has been completed, and then finally when all of the lateral chapels have been applied to the outer perimeter, and a version of this that considers the highest point of decoration possible within the church calendar. So the first challenge was creating the model for Notre Dame 2, because this building only exists as the remnants found underneath the modern-day parvis. So to create 1163 from the void, so to speak, I identified a reference basilica. In this case, it was one measured by Francesco Martellata and a collaborator, Santa Sabina al Aventino in Rome, which is also a very, very beautiful church. And using the measurements and the architectural model of Santa Sabina, I created and calibrated its digital acoustic twin to recreate the acoustic properties inside the model that had been measured in actuality. That led me to a baby church that then needed to be morphed to fit the floor plan and the proposed reconstruction of Notre Dame 2. So after morphing this geometry to fit, the final step was to determine how tall this building likely would have been, and that was done in reference to width and length to height ratios of many other comparable churches. I believe I looked at 20 other basilicas in this style to determine a likely range of possible heights for this church. So now that we have the models, we need to start thinking about the objective metrics. Now, a point to comment on here is that all of the metrics we accept today in room acoustics were developed in the 20th century post-Sabine, and they therefore follow certain assumptions about the musical content of what is being performed in a space. They follow assumptions about the way an audience would listen to the music, and therefore there's not always like a very easy one-to-one relationship between what might have been performed in a space 800 years ago and the metrics that we use in the 21st century to describe it. So rather than using a clarity index for this slide, we're looking at center time, which is the ratio of energy, late and early arriving within a space. In this case, a low center time means that the bulk of the acoustic energy is shifted towards the beginning of the reverberation, so early reflections, and a long center time is one where most of the energy comes at the end of the reverb. So because the Catholic Church in this time period really only considered the priests to be active members of a service, we will be considering sources located inside the consecrated area of the cathedral only. So in this case, we have an omnidirectional source located inside the cathedral where one of the cantors would have been singing, and we're looking at that energy balance over the entire occupied zone of the cathedral over time. A couple things that we can notice right away is as we change from the 1163 model to the Gothic model, the area of the highest clarity of the most early energy expands dramatically as a result of the most proximate reflecting surfaces being moved in directly next to where the cantors and the priests would have been performing. And we also see that over time, this sort of acoustic separation between the sacred and the profane areas of the church remain constant. And we actually only see real improvements in the amount of energy and potential intelligibility, specifically in the highly decorated state. So if you were a visitor to the cathedral in 1350, and you wanted to listen to the priests singing mass behind their walls, you were kind of out of luck, unless you happened to visit on a high feast day, in which case you could probably hear things a bit better. So if we now start to look at reverberation time, which is a little bit more objective, we can start to see some really interesting comparisons. So the 1163 model and the 1182 model both have very similar internal volumes, but the rearrangement of the architectural features totally changes the way that we would be experiencing the overall amount of reverberation within the space. If we look at the difference between the 1182 model and 1220 when the nave has been added, just the addition of that nave constitutes a massive increase in the overall reverberation time. And then I think the one that's the most interesting is the comparison between 1350 and 1500, where as soon as you add the tapestries and the people and all of the accoutrement of a high religious feast, you see the reverberation time drop off just in a night and day way. There's no room for interpretation here. These are significant acoustic changes. So looking at these results, we can say that the change in the architectural style from the old cathedral to the modern one does create a very strongly different acoustical environment, which increased the amount of early energy that priests inside the choir would have been exposed to, and also lowers the overall reverberation time. So pretty good change. In a smaller scale building with a less total amount of reverberation time, both of these shifts would be considered to be broadly favorable to support good musical performance and good speech intelligibility. Now, I'm not sure if either of these metrics really apply when you're talking about a reverb time of 5 seconds, but if we were to think about it proportionally speaking, these are both beneficial changes. The change from 1182 to 1220 is also very dramatic for people outside of the consecrated area, but the acoustics of the choir itself remain pretty constant, so the priests likely wouldn't have noticed much of a change. And then finally, we can make the observation that the acoustics of Notre Dame do prioritize the experience of the priests and fall into alignment with the cultural expectations of the use of the space. Now, of course, we've looked at the objective metrics. Oh, I am running short. So we've looked at the objective metrics. I'm going to go through and talk quickly about the singing experiments. So, of course, when you talk about musical communication and ensemble communication, we're talking about many modes of interaction. You have visual, you have pre-rehearsals, all of these different things. All of these modes of communication go into influencing an overall performance. And if you're trying to study these, it becomes quite difficult if you're recreating a space that no longer exists. Because if you have a real space, you can just plop your choir in the space and say, hey, that's great. But as soon as you start dealing with virtual rooms and rooms that no longer exist, you have a complex signal processing pathway that introduces many places that you could potentially mess this up. So in the first year of my PhD, I spent a lot of time learning how not to design one of these things. You can see here instances of the choir creating extreme coping mechanisms to deal with the oralization system, which is not ideal when you want them to act naturally. But in the end, we were able to create a system that worked well. We're going to skip that and just say, looking at some of the measures of musical performance, the distance between onsets, so whether or not they were actually arriving at the beats together, varied by choir and also varied by the interaction term of choir and song, but it remained pretty constant between all of the acoustics that I put them in. And looking at the overall range of motion, so the nonverbal communication, when we looked at the overall communication, what we saw is that choir A was strongly affected by the acoustic and the acoustic song interaction term, but choir B only really was paying attention to the acoustic. So in both cases, the choirs were changing their nonverbal communication patterns in an attempt to adapt to the acoustics. That's essentially what this slide says. I'm going to jump ahead real quick. We also know that there were people listening in the choir, and they were making judgment calls. We have an archive of the Bishop of Paris in 1198 saying, from now on, this new style of music will be performed on the high feast days. So we also wanted to see what people's reaction would be to the favorability of this music inside the acoustic of the choir. To do that, I ran 2 listening tests with specialists in medieval music as well as with general musicians performing as well. And I was asking them to rate the suitability of the acoustic to these 3 styles of music that we listened to. Again, we have a number of songs, a number of acoustics that they could have been exposed to. And if we skip ahead to the results of the listening test, the specialists tended to rate 1163 as less suitable to the later cathedral. So they tended to see a net improvement of the suitability of Wiederund Omnes, the complicated piece of music inside the new cathedral. The generalists also show a trend towards that direction, but they are a lot more conservative in the range of the answers that they provide. So the conclusions that we can draw from these listening tests is that there's a pretty strong correlation between increasing suitability rates and the amount of musical clarity that we see inside these spaces, and the sort of small to moderate improvement as we move from the second cathedral into the third cathedral. So from a modern perspective, we can look at both the objective metrics as well as the results of the singing and the listening tests and draw a conclusion that, at least for modern audiences and modern musicians recreating this style, we perceive the change in acoustics from Notre Dame 2 to Notre Dame 3 to be broadly favorable for the performance and reception of this music. Now, of course, we have a brain that is influenced by the development of this music, short of the very unethical experience of trying to raise small children as if they were still in the Middle Ages. I don't think we will ever actually have an answer to this question. But I think overall what we can see is we have added some level of scientific answer to this question that has been floating around in the musicological sphere for a long time. So I want to thank you all for your attention. I'd also like to thank all of the collaborators that I've had on this project, Elliot notably, but there's been a vast army of people who have worked with me and have preceded me in the work on the acoustics of this cathedral. So thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. On the last set of tests that you did with the kind of experts and the generalists, with the music that we're listening to from the recordings in these virtual acoustic spaces, were the listeners, or rather was the microphone, I guess you would call it, for the recording, where the singers were in the space?
Yeah, so each time I was virtually inserting my listener assessor into the position of the bishop in the cathedral. So for each of these examples, you have the choir standing close to the lectern where they would be performing, and you have the microphone, the virtual microphone in this case, recording from the perspective of the bishop.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you so much, Sarah Beth. Between, what are the years, 1163 and 1182, so the previous church is demolished and the second one is constructed all in that period of time?
Yeah, so the 1163 church, we have some archival information that it was starting to fall into disrepair. Mm-hmm. We know that in 1152, the king donates money to build a new roof on the building, but we have complaints. Basically, this house is no longer appropriate as a place of worship. We don't know precisely the timeline, if the priests would have been able to walk out of the second cathedral and directly into the third cathedral. Actually, if you give me a second here, if we go back to that site plan that I showed originally here, the location of the second cathedral is hypothesized to be around this area. So theoretically, they could have done that walk from one church into the other, but we simply don't have information about that.
Do you think that they would have recycled materials from the second into the construction of the third?
Yeah, it's highly likely.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I know you had to skip some slides for time, and maybe out of selfish interest, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the singing experiments and maybe what differentiated choir A and B, and particularly how you were measuring non-visual communication among the choir members.
Yeah, where to start?
Non-visual, yeah.
So I chose 2 choirs. Ideally, I will be able to expand this to more choirs. Historically informed performance is like a very contentious and very wide range of opinions that are represented these days. So choir A and choir B were both trained in different philosophies of what it means to perform medieval music accurately. And consequently, one of them tends to perform as a conducted ensemble, whereas the other one tends to perform unconducted. In terms of the nonverbal communication, and again, I did have to skip through this pretty quickly, I used a face tracking software and the output of the face tracking software to look specifically at head pose and eye pose estimations, and then used that to calculate an instantaneous, a note by note, and a global quantity of motion, which basically just says how much did this person's face move around, and can we find a temporal link where maybe I'm increasing the amount of motion at the same time that you're also increasing the amount of motion. So we're looking at rather than directional movement patterns, which is one of the areas that I continue to work on this data set in. This particular analysis is just looking at overall mobility of the singers.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. So as a musicologist, I just want to stress that Notre Dame de Paris is so important for the development of the European history, developing out of a monophonic chant, what I'm working on, and then exploding in that polyphony. And it's the example par excellence for musicologists on the interactions between music and architecture and those styles. So it's fantastic to have these new technologies and the new findings that you presented us. And in Sicily, it's more or less the same time we're working on the same decades.
Yeah.
And what I didn't mention in my talk is that a few decades later, so around 1200, there's also new polyphony developing in Sicily, and this might have been influenced by Paris and the Normans as well. So thank you very much. Did I get that right? To also take a question that so while the cathedral was being constructed, which took decades and several lifetimes to be built, that for the clergy it didn't make much difference, the acoustics in this gigantic choir with the choir stalls, that for them it did not change much, but more for the people, normal people gathering than in the developing nave?
Yes, yeah, you did get that correct. There, like I said, there is this massive change from the second to the third cathedrals, but I could have showed any number of other acoustic parameters in these plots, and you would see pretty much exactly the same behavior of a segmentation of an area of excellent acoustics inside the choir and inside the sanctuary, and strongly diminishing returns in the profane areas of the church.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Mullins for that excellent talk.
Thanks. Good afternoon and welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice long lunch break. Evan Graves, I think I've met a lot of folks here. We're so happy to have everyone here for our last panel of the symposium. But I will add, after this panel, we're going to have a short coffee break, and then we're going to have something of an open discussion here to discuss kind of the interdisciplinary possibilities of virtual acoustics and VR and XR more generally. So I really hope you can stick around for that. But looking at the wrong page. Okay, so welcome to this panel on virtual reality, affect, and emotion. So we're going to have 3 speakers, each doing 20-minute papers, and we're going to have time for Q&A in between. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Eito Murakami, a PhD student at Karma at Stanford University. Eito is an electronic composer, performer, sound designer, and virtual reality developer. He combines his classical music training with proficiency in audio and graphic software to create digital interfaces and instruments that promote playful workflows for multimedia performances. And his current research involves spatial reverberation and multiplayer interaction in virtual reality. And the title of the talk is little different than what I have here. Ambisonic convolution reverb in virtual reality. So please join me in welcoming Eito.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eito Murakami, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you for stopping by the VR booth. If you haven't, I think we'll be able to put that up again, maybe after this session, after we do the discussion. The topic that I'm talking about today is the use of ambisonic convolution reverb in virtual reality for musicological and archaeological studies. My education and background are in multimedia art and virtual reality short films. And for the past 2 years, I've been fortunate to work with Jonathan, Nima, and Luna at Karma. And as you saw in Luna's presentation yesterday of the Chauvet Cave, my task has been to create immersive virtual reality experiences using the assets that they collect out in the field and turning them into something that you can see in a room like this one. I'll divide the talk into 5 different sections. First, I'll share the techniques and workflows that we've been using for the creation of virtual environments. Second, I'll discuss our previous approach to ambisonic convolution reverb in VR and its affordance as well as limitations. Third, I'll share our team's new workflow in streamlining the creation of such virtual experiences. I'll spend a large chunk of time doing a live demo of the new proposed system, and I'll conclude by discussing the study's significance as well as future work. Let's dive into the first topic. In a handful of the VR experiences that we've created, we have used primarily 4 different techniques in creating the visual asset for the scene. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, scanning of point cloud uses a fairly portable camera and can maintain decent accuracy when converted into a mesh. Photogrammetry requires taking a series of pictures, as you perhaps saw in Sergio's presentation of the Saqqara tomb yesterday with the long pole. The mesh resulting from the technique can have very complex details, but at the cost of large amounts of data. 3D modeling by hand is sometimes required for sites that are no longer accessible, and this is very time-consuming yet necessary, and due to the nature of manual labor, the resulting mesh is often simplified unless the engineer is able to spend a large amount of time creating the mesh. Lastly, the 360-degree images are cheaper alternatives to the other techniques, and equipment that are required are more accessible, including modern smartphones and tablets. The images can often preserve complex textures, but the images themselves are inherently static as opposed to other meshes. As far the tools for creating a virtual environment, these are some of the tools that we've used in the past. We have the Leica scanning camera for the LiDAR scanning, Rhino for 3D modeling by hand, Blender sometimes for 3D modeling, and we often import all of these assets into Unreal Engine for the VR experiences. As far as measuring the impulse responses, you likely got to hear quite a bit from Luna yesterday about her techniques in deploying the microphones and loudspeakers in the cave. We're able to do that for sites that are accessible, but for sites that no longer exist or are accessible, we use Odeon software to get an approximation for the impulse responses. And Sergio showed some of these GIFs yesterday in his presentation of the Saqqara tombs. Once we have all of these virtual environments set up, we perform real-time convolution of audio sources, such as wave files or microphone signals, with the impulse responses. The use of ambisonic convolution reverb itself is well discussed in the literature, but still not widely accessible in the applications like immersive games and films. Although a mono-channel impulse response can in fact capture the characteristics of the entire room, it doesn't account for the directionalities of the echoes, and ambisonic reverb, even in the first order, can create a much more enveloping virtual space. The workflow that we used in this 2023 paper titled Exploring the Past with Virtual Acoustics and Virtual Reality is as follows. We first decode the either measured or simulated first-order ambisonic impulse responses using loudspeakers turned into virtual speakers in VR. And this is similar to the configuration that we have at Karma, and this is a studio called the Listening Room. And so we took the orientations of these speakers and simplify them into the virtual speakers. The number of the virtual speakers in this case is scalable. In the diagram here, we're using the simplified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 speakers. After we've decoded the impulse responses, we would import them into Unreal Engine and perform real-time convolution of a dry audio source that you want to play in the scene with each of these. And then we use Dolby Atmos plugin for Unreal Engine for taking the sound field and binauralizing ultimately into left and right ears. So that's what we did. Here is a video that used this technique, and some of you got to see this over lunch.
Course prescribed for surgeons in the army. Having completed my studies there, I was duly attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers.
The regiment was stationed in India at the time. Before I could join it, it was an Afghan war that I handled. On landing in Bombay, I learned from my colleague that without speaking Farsi, it was already deemed the enemy's country. I followed, however, with many other officers who had learned of the same situation as myself, and succeeded in reaching Canfield-Dafilou safely, where I found my regiment and at once entered upon my new duties. The campaign brought honors and promotion to many.
But for me, it had nothing but misfortune and disaster. I was removed from my brigade and attached to the Berkshires, with whom I served at the fatal battle of Mile One. There I was struck on the shoulder by a Josalian bullet, which shattered the bone and grazed the subclavian artery. I should have fallen into the hands of the murderous Gavasis, had it not been for the devotion and courage shown by Murray, my orderly, who threw me across a pack horse and succeeded in bringing me safely.
So, as you saw in the demo video and the workflow that I've discussed so far, there are varying degrees of requirements for each scene. So, I propose a new streamlined toolkit here that facilitates deployment of the collected audiovisual assets into VR experiences and minimizes, or in some cases, eliminates the need to use a game engine in the workflow. I borrowed the open source spatial audio framework code, which is the engine of the Sparta plugins that I'm sure many of you have used, and created a plugin for Unreal Engine along with the Chuck music programming language inside Unreal Engine. So the plugin includes features such as being able to take first order ambisonic signals and performing binaural decoding that binaurally. Also, it has a utility tool for converting the A format ambisonic signals into the B format so that you don't have to do that in Reaper before importing into Unreal Engine or the system. And finally, performing real-time convolution with any audio sources. So, for the exciting part, I'd like to do a live demo using this new proposed toolkit. So I'll get off the slides and launch the system. I'm calling it the ambisonic convolution listener. I'm gonna mute it for now. What's happening here is that there's an interactive panel. This is this software itself can handle VR or non-VR interactions. So I'm launching it in the non-VR mode because I don't have a headset with me. Some of you saw this over the lunch break using the VR headset. So I have 5 scenes defined here, 3 for Ospedaletto and 2 for Chauvet. So I'm able to click on any of these, and each scene has a corresponding 360 image and an ambisonic impulse response, as well as an audio source that I want to use in that scene. I'll click on Ospedaletto 2, for example.
In 1978, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine of the University of London and proceeded to Netley to go through the course prescribed for surgeons in the army. Having completed my studies there, I was duly attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers as assistant surgeon.
The difficulty of presenting this is that it's supposed to be a binaural representation of the sound field, and you don't get any of that using the loudspeakers. So it doesn't do justice. But the idea is that because we're using the ambisonic impulse responses, the reverb itself is spatialized. And this is very different from just using a mono impulse response, where you seem to get the characteristics of the room, but without any of the directionalities. We're using a mono source in this case, so it's a convolution of a mono source and the ambisonic impulse response. In this case, the speaker is located up in the balcony on the right side, and you can locate that pretty well if you're wearing headphones. The nice feature of this demo is that I can toggle the convolution on and off, and it also changes the color of the background.
Artery. I should have fallen into the hands of the murderous Ghazis had it not been for
the devotion and courage shown by Murray, my orderly, who threw me across.
And then I can open the menu, go to one of the Chauvets, for example. Okay, so that's cool, but how's it different from what I was doing before? Well, I'll show you what it takes to create scenes like this. So inside the application that has the executable itself, titled Ambisonic Convolution Listener, there's a folder called Content, and that's what has all of these assets. So specifically, there's a JSON config file called scenes, and if you open it, this is what defines the scenes. And this is a very different workflow from having to create a separate application inside Unreal Engine or Unity or whatever else that you're using for each demo. So you can see the properties of each scene. Here, in the first scene, I'm defining the 360 image to be Ospedaletto1.jpg, which happens to be stored in the images folder, right? And I am telling the system to use the images folder, otherwise you have to specify the absolute path. I'm able to rotate this image using the roll, pitch, yaw. The system uses a modular workflow, so 360 image on its own is independent of the ambisonic convolution. And here I'm able to specify the source file that I want to play, which happens to be stored in the audio sources folder, just like the images. And I'm able to specify what IR I want to use in this scene. And I'm able to specify the gain, and finally convert the A format to the B format ambisonic signals inside the system. So I thought that it might be fun to actually try to add a scene to this based on fresh assets that I got from Luna this morning and show you what it's like. So with the software still running in the background, I'm gonna try to add a new scene to this, like that. And one scene that I have in the folder that I don't have in the scene config file is one called Chauvet H1. So I'm going to change F to H here, which is going to use the images folder. I'm going to try to use the cave music that Luna and her team put together for this demo, which is going to live inside the audio sources folder. And I'm going to say that I want to use the IR that corresponds to this 360 image that I have here, which looks like this. And then that. Back in the system, I'm able to reload the config file, and now there's a new entry in the panel. And this works for VR and non-VR as well. So I can click on it, and that's my new scene. It's fairly quick. This scene seems to be a rather dry scene, but I'm able to still turn on and off convolution. And so that's the idea. So back in the slides, the toolkit has yet to implement all the features of our previous system, which can incorporate 3D meshes and point cloud, as well as the continuous interpolation of the virtual speakers. Nevertheless, the ongoing progress in designing this toolkit attempts to offer two different benefits to the musicological and archaeological studies. First, the toolkit provides the foundation for deploying the collected audiovisual assets into the VR experiences. The toolkit is starting to be used in designing the immersive VR experiences for the Chauvet Cave, which is not open to the general public. Furthermore, it is used as one of the primary software in research conducted by Nima, who will soon present his study on assessing the effects of acoustics in perception experiments. The modular workflow of the toolkit provides extensible APIs for those who would like to customize the features inside the Unreal Engine project. So I've said that you don't have to use a game engine to build scenes like this, but if you want to add more scenes, such as being able to add a questionnaire inside the VR application, you're able to do so. And the second benefit that I'd like to propose here is that the toolkit attempts to offer a standardized format for defining a simplified VR scene. The idea of building a library of impulse responses has been already brought up a couple of times in this symposium. And the toolkit can serve as a playground for interactively building a scene using any of the visual asset techniques that I presented earlier, like 3D meshes or point cloud or 360 images. Ultimately, we're interested in building this platform where research groups can share the measured, recorded, or simulated assets and promote collaboration between the research groups. So, here you only have 4 scenes, but I would love to see what it's like to be able to create more scenes inside the application. For example, I showed you a demo of editing the config file using text, but being able to have interactive graphical user interface where you're able to specify the image, the impulse response, the audio file that you want to use, and having that almost as a project file for you to be able to distribute your assets with your colleagues that live somewhere else, for example. So that's what I have. Here are the references for some of the stuff that I presented. And I'd like to acknowledge the staff and faculty at Karma, as well as colleagues from other universities and different institutions that have supported the research. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that was fascinating. That was the first time I saw anyone code during a presentation. I'm really impressed. So we have a good 10 minutes or so for questions, so go on here.
I have 2 questions. The first one is about the toolkit. Is it open source? What's its name and how can we access it?
Yeah.
Second question is about the Persian mosque. The outdoor scene seemed very reverberant. So I was curious, this was an oralization, so I was curious if Nima was the one who recorded, did he experience the same thing?
Nima would be able to answer the second question a lot better, but as for the first question, it's in the beta form, so it is currently not open source, but that's definitely the goal. The proposal is to create this open source library where everyone can access the framework as well as the underlying library for building scenes like this. And I'd like to start testing in a more controlled private environment with you, for example, the fellow researchers. I'd like to see what it's like to be able to use this tool and what kind of features would be useful to have. Currently I still have to add a lot of features back into the new system, such as supporting the 3D meshes and point cloud and things like that. should the interpolation happen in a more sophisticated way rather than simple power-preserving interpolation that we did in the old system. So there's a lot of questions, and I'm excited to be able to present this proposal in the immature state. And so I'm grateful to have this space where I can share ideas and get feedback. So yeah, I'd like to talk more about the use of this. And
Thank you.
yeah, so the second question, you know, what's funny is that I've never been to any of the sites that I've presented. Not Chauvet, not Ospedaleto, and not Isfahan. And I just trust the judgment of the guys that collect the assets. Nima, do you want to say anything about whether it actually sounds that reverberant outside?
I couldn't hear the question.
Was it as reverberant when you were there? Because it's an outdoor scene, so I was surprised to see
Like the semi-outdoor impulse response. The one that is close to the portal, inside the portal, and it's facing the tiling and Mokarnas and all those, like, it's a very huge space, and it is really reverberant, yes, yes. Not as reverberant as inside, but still very reverberant.
Great talk. Thanks, Eto. I'm not sure if you mentioned it or not, but does it take only 360 images right now, or does it have capability of, you know, importing a bunch of still images around?
Still images around. Oh, I haven't thought about that, to be honest with you. I'm not sure what kind of format it would have or the protocol, but we should be able to support still images. Yes, it's great. Thanks for that question. I wonder what that would look like.
Just on the previous question about the outdoor environment, sometimes when you have environments like that where the sound is escaping upwards, but you get these strong lateral reflections, you know, it sounds more realistic when you're there in person, or maybe in the binaural effect as well, because your ears can actually track that directionality, that it is mainly lateral reflection. So maybe if we were hearing the binaural, it would sound more natural to us. That was just a hypothesis, I guess. I don't know.
Great, thanks for sharing that.
Just the question I had, I was looking at, you were using the impulse response wave files to kind of calibrate the quality of the ambisonic decoding, and I guess the question is the system capable of, what would it look like to transition from one aural environment to another?
Yeah.
One, is that possible? And two, you know, what is the degree of complexity that comes through that process?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's been the big research question for a while. In the old system, as we call it, in the demo that I showed, we are interpolating between two sets of virtual speakers. So one is for where you are standing, and the other one standing by for where you probably will go next. So it's getting the neighboring systems. And what we're doing here is the power-preserving panning or crossfade between the two systems. And what that results in is weird phasing artifacts and possible duplicates of early reflections and cancellation and things like that. There are papers that I've read that attempt to account for this by doing something a little bit more sophisticated than simple panning. I think it also is very dependent on the delta between the two places, the delta in the frequency responses and time domain responses. If they're similar enough, you can probably continue to interpolate between these narrow grids without noticing the artifacts as much, whereas, you know, this place versus outside, the big interpolation is going to sound very odd in the middle. So that spatial interpolation and resolution that we need for doing this rather dumb panning, we haven't figured out. So I'm trying to see if it would make sense to make that a little bit more sophisticated in the new system. But thanks for that question.
No, thank you.
I'm biased because I work with Michael, and I'm like, I want to hear, but then I feel like I should give them the mic at least. We can do two more. Okay, go ahead. We can do two more. It's like this was really any fun.
Thanks, Justin. So, I mean, one of the things that's also like really hard to control for that we kind of experienced here is you don't have control over how people listen to oralizations that are spatialized. You don't have control over HRTF matching or whether somebody's just gonna like play this off their laptop speakers. And this might be an out of scope question, but I'd love to pick your brain about like how this framework can be made robust to the variety of ways in which it might be experienced by the user.
That's a great question. I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot, like the 2D, 3D approach that I've done where you can launch the application without the VR headset plugged in and you get the mouse version versus the headset and you get the controller interactions. That's like my first attempt to tackle questions like that. And the difficulty here is that there's just infinite number of questions like those, and I think it just comes down to beta testing a little bit more and figuring out what kind of controlled environments we can use this in. Because this doesn't, this is not the ultimate solution or anything like that. This is just a proposal for offering some sort of format into the system. So, yeah, other things I can think of are like, headphones, what kind of headphones you're using, rather cheap headphones versus more flat headphones, the microphone that you're using, if you're using microphone as the input signal. There's just many questions, and I'm looking forward to using this more to find the questions and answer the questions.
Yeah, likewise.
Thanks.
Thanks.
That was a long journey for a relatively short question. In my research group, we tend to default to use of like Unity or Unreal, these game engines, because of their capacity to support OSC sync with motion capture systems. And I was wondering, in general, how hard would it be to incorporate that sort of real-time motion tracking data into what you currently have in your framework?
Okay. Can I ask a question actually?
Sure.
What's the use of the motion capture in your study?
So, for instance, a colleague of mine was also working on this question of spatial interpolation of impulse responses. So to test, sort of human sensitivity to different forms of spatial interpolation. He ran an experiment inside a motion capture room where the study participant was free to wander within the space, and that would change the rendering of a stable sound source interpolated between certain listening locations inside the room.
I see. Okay. So motion capturing as in being able to track the location of where the person is.
Yes, in real time.
Okay. Yeah. I believe that's very doable. The bigger question is how we interpolate rather than how we track. Because the affordance of the VR is that you have the tracking for free, right, without having to wear extra. So I believe that's very doable. The question is, what kind of large room can we prepare to allow for such interactions? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we have like an OptiTrack room set up. Right. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question.
Let's thank Eito one more time for a great presentation. Okay, so next, really pleased to introduce Dr. Ala Aragagush, Assistant Professor of Architecture at Virginia Tech. Dr. Aragagush research bridges architecture, environmental psychology, and computational design, focusing on the transformative role of sound in shaping human experiences, enhancing well-being, and fostering social connection. She has won many prestigious awards and was recognized as an innovator under 35 by the MIT Technology Review. So while she gets the setup, we'll just mention the title of the talk is Resonant Portals, Transformative Sonic Experiences. So let's please welcome Dr. Aragagush.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. First, thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to share my work, Resonant Portals, Transformative Sonic Experiences. I'll be talking about the sonic experience in sacred spaces without presenting almost any sacred space. So let's see how that goes. I also wanted to mention that the work that I'll be presenting is two ongoing projects, and it includes collaborators both from Virginia Tech and MIT Media Lab, where I started one of these projects last year. I'm also a research affiliate at the MIT Media Lab this year as well, so I continue the collaborations. Okay, so what is the essence of the sonic experience of sacred spaces? I started this question a few years ago, and the first thing that I was interested in investigating was resonance. But to explore this question, let's go in a portal that will allow us to travel through space and time in an attempt to answer the question about the essence of the sonic experience of sacred spaces and how we can take advantage of that in our daily lives. So my first project in that area was the Aural Affect project, in which I wanted to understand the impact of acoustic experiences on human emotions and well-being. In that project, I used VR. I included the visuals with the acoustics because I was interested in the acoustic experience shaped by the architectural features, not listening to it as just a sound recording. I investigated the psychological and physiological aspects of such experiences. For the physiological aspects, I used biosignals, including heart rate and skin conductance as an objective measure. But the objective measures of biosignals just tells us whether there is an intense emotional impact. It doesn't tell us what kind of emotional impact is that. So in some of the experiences, there was an intense emotional impact, which was positive, like spiritual, for example. But for some participants, the emotional impact was intense, but that was because some of them, due unfamiliarity with such acoustic experiences, there was the feeling of terror. The familiarity was related to horror movies. So just to explain why I needed to include both, I wanted to go into more depth of understanding the experience. So that covered the perceptual aspects of the impact of acoustic experiences of, I used 4 buildings, which were worship spaces, including mosques and churches, to understand that impact on emotions and well-being. But I also, from the physical aspects, I wanted to develop a method to analyze resonance in spaces with complex geometries. So that covered the physical aspect. And the goal was to bring both together through linking them, which was the next step, correlating the emotional indicators with the acoustic metrics in order to understand the role of architectural features in creating such an acoustic experience that enhance well-being. So I'd just like to highlight one of the results of that previous research, which was interesting to see that the building that was rated the highest for the intensity of the emotional impact or the spiritual emotion was the one with the highest resonance quality at low frequencies. As you can see here, also it was the one with the most distinguished architectural geometry. So all the previous work that I've done was focused on evaluating the impact of acoustic environments on the human experience using worship spaces as case studies. But then the next question was, now, how can I design spaces that can enhance well-being? How can I design supportive acoustic experiences based on this knowledge? So here I introduce 2 projects. One of them focuses on traveling through space, the sound escape project, and then the other one will focus on time, and I'll introduce it shortly. So sound escape. The name of this project was combining two words, soundscape, and then sound and escape. The goal of the project was to explore how can acoustic environments elicit the emotions of awe and wonder in a way that allow us to restore attention based on the attention restoration theory in environmental psychology. So based on this theory, if we expose participants to a stimulus that is called soft fascination, opposite to hard fascination. So if we consider some types of music can be considered as hard fascination, how can we achieve soft fascination with a stimulus that is engaging enough but not overstimulating to the senses? So the goal was to expose people to unconventional, unique acoustic experiences rather than high quality acoustics, such as, for example, concert halls. And the goal was to enhance well-being for the general public, but the long-term goal was also to provide a coping mechanism for neurodivergent individuals, more specifically individuals with ADHD, given that their major challenge is related to attention, ADHD, attention deficit. So how can we provide a coping mechanism through the acoustic experiences to restore that attention? The majority of research in the attention restoration theory focuses on visuals. There has been some recent research in using soundscape for attention restoration, but again, even within that, the majority of research focuses on urban soundscape, nature sounds such as birds and water. But what I wanted to experiment with is that given that we already have a successful model of spaces that people visit to enhance their well-being, to connect with other people, which is an indoor space, why don't we take advantage of this instead of exposing people to natural soundscapes indoors, so it doesn't seem organic. So at the first step in exploring the potential of this project, I participated in an event at the MIT Museum titled Meditation, Art, and Neuroscience in Conversation. We had in the panel a psychologist and a monk. And through this experience, I asked one of the audience members to join me for a real-time oralization through spontaneous humming with the impulse response of Aya Sophia. And then I played back the oralization, and I asked the audience members to hum together with it. And then at the end, we asked them to share their reflections. There has been a lot of interesting reflections, but I'll share the ones that stood out, which are 3, and I'll explain why. So one said that they felt that they were outside their head. Another person mentioned that they felt as if they are traveling to a different place, which makes sense because they were interacting with an acoustic environment different than the ones that they are in. And then a third person mentioned that they kind of lost sense of time, which my explanation could be because of the reverberation, they're listening to the sound of now and a few milliseconds ago merging together. So an interesting comment from the monk, he said that that's why they do the mantras in meditation. They repeat the words to enhance this feeling of losing sense of time. And the reason why I selected these 3 reflections is because the psychologist said that these are the 3 pillars of meditation: losing sense of self, losing sense of time, and losing sense of space. So I thought, okay, there is a great potential for this project. So that's why I named this, the whole presentation, Sonic Portals. My vision is to create a portal in which people can travel to different places, different times, and be immersed in such an experience as a restorative activity. So the first step in order to create or design restorative experiences the question was, what are the features of such experiences, the acoustic characteristics? So I wanted to identify the psychoacoustic characteristics that can be used to design soundscapes that lead to restorative experiences and enhance well-being. I went back to the ISO standard of soundscapes, which includes psychoacoustic metrics and affective responses. I selected 3 of the psychoacoustic metrics, including sharpness, fluctuation strength, and roughness. And then for the affective response, this model, it includes pleasant, eventful, annoying, and uneventful. And it corresponds to the Russell model of emotions, in which the vertical axis, the top side of it, is the emotional arousal is equivalent to eventful. And then the positive side of valence is the pleasant acoustic experience. So we used a data set in which previous researchers have conducted the experiment and collected the data. So they exposed the participants to soundscapes, urban soundscapes, mostly sounds of nature, and it includes also a variety of urban soundscapes, such as like traffic noise and so on. And they collected the affective responses to these soundscapes, and they also analyzed their psychoacoustic metrics. So I wanted to establish a correlation between the psychoacoustic metrics and the affective responses to use them in designing such experiences. And here's what I got. There was a correlation, but it was not what I was hoping for. I found a strong correlation if we take a look at sharpness, fluctuation strength, and roughness, the psychoacoustic metrics, and then the horizontal axis represents the affective response. You will see that the highest values, the highest correlation with these 3 metrics were mostly the negative experiences, annoying and eventful. So in this case, to explain it further, if we have a soundscape that includes birds and traffic noise, and the traffic noise is more dominant, let's say sharpness or roughness was high in this example of the soundscape. If I reduce the roughness, then the soundscape will be less unpleasant, but it's not going to make it pleasant. And my goal was to establish metrics that allow us to design positive soundscapes. Going back to this example of resonance, I was reflecting a lot in what is the essence of the sonic experience in sacred spaces. And one inspiring comment through discussing this project with the students who were working with me was we were talking about how in these spaces, humans were fascinated with the way that the environment was responding to them. So it was more of an interactive experience. So it might not be only about resonance or reverberation or loudness, but it's the act of listening to your voice being adjusted based on the acoustic environment. And that's dynamic. I mean, while you walk through the space, that adjustment is different. And that's maybe creating the awe-inspiring experience, the exposure to unconventional or changing fluid acoustic experience. So my student Megan is now working on this project, and we are focusing on how the real-time auralization itself as an experience can be one of the main aspects that creates the restorative sonic experience, not only the acoustic features, but we're also considering the acoustic features, and I'll explain this in a little bit. So our goal, I shared previously the affective response model, and the correlation was on the negative side. Our goal is to establish metrics to allow us to design acoustic experiences within the other side of pleasant, not so high, like moderate emotional arousal. And our hypothesis is that this is the space in which we can create the soft fascination, because the higher emotional arousal will reach to the heart fascination point, and that's not what we wanted to achieve because it might be overstimulating. So we have, similar to these pods, which are called sleeping pods at Virginia Tech in the Student Center. So we're thinking, looking at that and thinking of the Sonic Portal project, we're thinking, what if we can have similar pods, like in the architecture department, for example, for students, when they take break, they can go there and then they can engage in an interactive sonic experience that helps them to restore their attention. So what we're doing now is that we are collecting impulse responses and then modifying some of the acoustic characteristics, and that's part of the work that we are still doing. What kind of acoustic features do we want to manipulate using Max software? And then we have the neurable headphones, which is a headphone, but at the same time, it collects brain activity. So it's an EEG device at the same time. So our experimental design includes collecting the EEG at the beginning and then also measuring attention through the attention test. And then also after that, exposing the participants to a stressor, and then exposing them to the stimulus that we will be designing, and then again measuring their attention after that exposure. And we are collecting the brain activity throughout the experiment. This is a demo by Haron Zhang, who is a student at Harvard GSD, who was part of this project last summer. And this is just to show how we are anticipating to modify the acoustic characteristics of an impulse response.
Production of this. So for example, we can have a high pass. It's actually not quite noticeable on this one. But if we start to say we reduce or increase the gain of the higher frequencies, production.
And then Hector was trying to identify, Hector is a student at MIT, who was trying to identify what packages within Max correspond to the psychoacoustic metrics identified by the ISO standard. So that's what we are trying to work on to define what kind of acoustic characteristics do we want to adjust within the impulse responses. I wanted to acknowledge their efforts. Hector Astrom, Ali Hong, and Jean Yu presented this as part of the Flash Talk Challenge at Internoise, also last summer in France. And then acknowledge MIT for supporting this project through the MIT IBK Research Award. So now we'll travel through time with the Sonic Portal project. So the motivation behind this project started through a collaboration with Hiroshi Ishii, who is a PI at the MIT Media Lab, in his project that is called teleabsence. Teleabsence, the goal of it, unlike telepresence, which allow us to communicate with people at different locations in real time. One example is through Zoom. Telepresence, the goal of it is to allow us to connect with a moment in remote time. So it's traveling through time. An example of this is that if we capture the sound escape of, not necessarily like a recording of the speech, but that one of the principles of this project, as you can see, is the presence of absence and through creating an illusory communication. So we're trying to find what kind of sensory input can we provide to give you that sense of a presence of a moment from the past. I actually used the Notre Dame in this paper recently published in Presence as an example of connecting with a moment in remote time to illustrate this. Another project that followed the teleabsence was the Mirror Fugue with Xiao Xiao as the lead of this project, but the same team of the teleabsence. This is a fascinating project in which she started in 2012 through recording a child playing the piano. And then now, after more than 10 years, she asked the same child to play with her past self in a duet. And I'll share the video now to give you a more sense of how this was working. So in this case, the keys of the pianos are moving depending on the previous self that was playing. So it was, in this case, connecting with a remote time as a reflection with your past self. The previous one was connecting with a moment, a remote time with another person. This one, it could be with another person, but this example is with yourself. So I'll play this video to give you a better sense of the project.
Projection mapping onto a piano, but it's a Yamaha disc linear piano where the keys move. And so through the combination of the life-size projection of video of a pianist's body and hands onto the keys and the music stand and the actual moving keys of the piano and the acoustic sound coming out of the piano, it somehow tricks people's brains into thinking or feeling that there is a presence of the virtual pianist in front of them.
I found myself just glued to the hands, and we never really think about recording people's hands.
So as a natural progress from that project, we were thinking about creating that connection with a past moment or connecting people through generations. So given that the 40 years anniversary of the Media Lab is approaching, it's going to be actually in October 2025, I asked this question of how do spatial sonic experiences influence memory evocation, place attachment, and social connection across different generations in the community. So in this project, what we're hoping for is to use the sonic experience as a trigger for a memory that establishes this social connection through different generations and then motivates people to support each other. And I'll explain how we are trying to answer this question through the experimental design. So we have a LiDAR scan of the Media Lab, and our plan is to, we have an archive of a lot of recording of different events at the Media Lab. And our thought was to place those recordings through Matterport here at the locations that you can see here. There are a lot of locations within the building. And then creating this sonic portal for people, sending it to alumni, and then testing whether through the memory scale to see if we can evoke their memories through the exposure to sonic experiences or shared sonic experiences, and then test the place attachment, and then hopefully we'll see a result related to the social connection. This is an experiment that we are currently still designing, so if you have any thoughts or feedback, I'd love to hear that. But our thought initially was that to test the social connection, we'll include some questions that will ask the participants whether they are willing to, let's say, mentor a current student at the Media Lab, and for how many hours or how many times per year, something like that. And from this, we get a sense of whether exposing them to that shared sonic experience that evoke their memory and enhance their place attachment will lead them to take that kind of positive action. So if I go back to the first question I asked at the beginning, what is the essence of the sonic experience of sacred space? Until now, what I reached to, and I hope that this will evolve through my research, is that it includes social connection through a sonic experience that allows you to travel through space and time, creating a transformative experience that enhances well-being. And then I'll end by asking you, what are your transformative acoustic experiences? Thank you.
Thanks for that fascinating talk, and you can answer that question now, or maybe you have your own questions yourself. So we have maybe 5 minutes or so for some questions or answers.
It looked like, and just to clarify and make sure I had it right, but with the SoundPod project that you were thinking about, it was allowing people to kind of make their own audio, generate their own voice, and then have that voice be kind of transmuted through the oralization process. Is that right?
Yeah, for the Sound Escape project.
Yeah,
yes, that's correct.
I thought that was really fascinating, and I guess I don't have a particularly salient question, but I would love to hear more about that, if not now, maybe after the thing. But I thought that was a really fascinating project.
Thank you, sure.
Hi, thank you so much for a really fascinating new world that's opened for me. When you were tracking you're describing tracking the physiological and emotional impacts as you were playing these different sound impulses, how did you account for different cultural backgrounds and makeups of the people that you actually, the guinea pigs that you were working on, essentially? Because one of the things I was trying to get at in my paper yesterday was this idea that, we know that everybody listens differently according also to their cultural makeup. So Ethiopian sensory thought would be very different. When I was in South Africa interviewing former political prisoners held during apartheid, I was investigating the question of music as used as torture and soundscape as torture. And one political prisoner described how he had been put in a cell and very, very loud music was played to him. And he said it was, it drove him crazy. It was absolute torture. And I said, well, what was it? And he said it was Bach. It was Bach stringed music, which he was from KwaZulu-Natal, rural area, had absolutely practically no exposure to any kind of Western, musical experience. And that for me was a very kind of profound insight into that. So I'm wondering how do you account for that as in the data?
Excellent question.
Thank you.
Actually, that was one of the motivations why I wanted to include the social and cultural aspects in the very first project, the oral architecture, the oral affect project. So because of my experience, I've experienced that entering different kinds of worship spaces that belongs to different religions. So I was thinking, what is the shared thing about all these places or about these experiences? So it was included actually in the study. So there was part of the question was related to familiarity. So we recruited participants from different backgrounds, different religions, non-religious people. And that's why when I mentioned the explanation of one of them, which was not familiar with religious spaces, that when they listened to such an experience of the Christian hymn or the Quran recitation in these two worship spaces with the echoes and reverberation, they could relate it only to horror movies. So that was part of the question I asked in that paper. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe one more question.
Okay, thank you so much. It reminds me of a quote somebody said that the thing that all religions have in common is that they all use candles, which I'm not even sure if that is true either. But the resonance quality you were talking about at the very beginning, I'm thinking on a similar line. There's this whole history of people speculating about caves as holy places, that people go in, they hear their own voice talk back to them, and maybe they hear parts of it amplified. So that looking at the 125 hertz band, I'm thinking for a soprano range versus a bass range, a bass might be able to excite some energy at 125 hertz, but a soprano would probably not. Do you think from your research that is an absolute effect of that frequency range on people, or is it more calibrated to people's own voices and their own expectations about how they expect their voice to sound in their head?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I got your question correctly. Are you saying that is this the low frequency range
is it more related to the characteristics of the space and acoustic environment itself, or is it also related to the interaction between the sound source and the voice played in that space? Is that your question?
Yeah, and their expectations about their own voice, how their
in
voice
that-
sounds in their head, and then how it sounds when they hear it in the
Yes.
space.
So in that project, it was not the real-time oralization. So they were listening passively to either a Quran recitation, which was recited by a male voice, and then a Christian hymn, which was by 4 people, 2 females and 2 males. And I noticed that the building that I mentioned, I was actually surprised to see that that was the one that elicited the more intense spiritual experiences for people, regardless of their background, because although we had people from different backgrounds, the majority of people were from Christian background more than Muslims, and this was a mosque. So my explanation is probably because that building amplified the resonance at low frequencies, and also the sound played in that was a male voice with the dominant frequencies at that range of frequency. So that's why I'm interested in the other paper that you probably familiar with, to not only analyze the room modes alone, but to analyze them with the sound source, because depending on the dominant frequency of the sound source, you might get different results that will affect people differently.
Okay, thank you so much.
Let's thank our speaker one more time for a wonderful talk. Great. So for our last presentation of this panel, I'm really pleased to introduce Nima Farzaneh, PhD candidate at Stanford University. And Nima is an architectural designer and researcher specializing in musical and architectural acoustics. His research explores the sonic dimensions of awe, examining how architectural geometry and acoustic properties shape cognitive processing and spatial perception, integrating virtual acoustics, psychoacoustics, and VR. And the title for the talk is The Sonic Sublime, Investigating Auditory Awe and Immersive Experiences for Emotional Well-Being. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse to be the last speaker of a symposium, but I take it as an honor, and I've revised my slides to make it more entertaining, so you're not tired at the end. Yes, I know. Anyway. Yeah, you cannot still see it, but soon. Okay. Yes, so very similar interests that Allah and I share, but I'm more new to this topic, and I'm using everyone's experience, and I'm in the process of developing this research. Gladly, since I'm the last one, I'm gonna speak for a while and not worrying about anyone after me, so please bear with me, but I try to be concise and short as possible. So to start with, as you can tell, I have chosen one of the most elaborated philosophical definition ever fascinated by the mind of a philosopher, the sublime. And this idea was seeded in my brain by my advisor, Jonathan. At first, I resisted it because honestly, it felt impossible to tackle something like that. But eventually, I gave up, and I'm now fully inside it, swimming it in content, confusion, and all of that. So most people don't even know this concept exists. It's an intellectual fabrication, but we all feel it at some time or some points in our lives. and those moments when something is so big or powerful or beautiful or pleasant that you feel amazed, small, or maybe a little scared. Can't believe that the sublime happens when we face something too vast or overwhelming for our senses, like a stormy ocean or a starry sky, but we realize that our ocean is even more powerful because it can rise above it. It's not just fear, it's fear transformed into admiration. So in my work, I focus on auditory awe, how sound alone can bring us to that place. Well, that's not a very correct statement. Like, we want to isolate sound and look at that side of it, hopefully. You can think of the sublime as the philosophical framework, and awe as the psychological and emotional experience. And they often describe the same kind of moment, just seen from a different angle. So here's my big question. Can we measure awe, this very elusive, mysterious emotion? Can we actually measure awe with the tools and knowledge we have today? Can we isolate the sound part and study it? Can we even go one step further and manipulate the brain to create a fake awe that feels real enough to elevate someone's emotional state to something unquestionably enjoyable and maybe even healing? And as you can see, it touches many different realms and like areas all gathered around sound and acoustics. Yeah, it's not easy to wrap your head around it. Anyway, if I put it simply, humans have always been fascinated by reverberant spaces. I think one of the first discoveries was that big spaces make sound more interesting. I mean, without having any further knowledge about it, especially in certain situations. And so people started using that in their religious spaces. Honestly, that's probably all we know for a long time. And maybe they noticed that smooth stone walls reflect sound better, or like when you cover a wall with curtains, it reduces the reflections, or things like that. There is some speculation about whether ancient builders really know that what they were doing with sound, and we've heard some of these during the past 2 days, but in most cases, I think they were just focused on structure, beauty, and maybe the gods, not acoustics. Architecture was already complicated enough, so there was probably no space left for sonic fantasies. I mean, I have worked in architecture firms for a long time, and I can verify that. We did not think about acoustics. So, for example, we can trace back the intentional verticality in sacred architecture back to ancient civilizations and see how it evolved dramatically in Gothic architecture or Safavid architecture. Ancient Greeks and Romans emphasized symmetry and proportion, but height was more symbolic than a functional necessity. There was one point that we explored: studying height is important, and we wanted to get focused on that, but for now we just accept that history has proven that tall buildings or rooms represent a sense of power and reminds us of our sense of smallness in presence of larger things. And there is also a lot of research about like the impact of ceiling height and stuff like that. Looking to the more recent time history, these images should be familiar to most of you. we became curious to understand why this happens. So we started doing some crazy experiments like this one, but not because we were chasing the joy of listening in music in reverberant spaces, but because we were trying to actually solve a very practical problem. Nobody could understand the professor because he wasn't loud enough, or the room was not appropriate for that. Thankfully, nowadays at Karma, our professors are lucky. They have all kinds of microphones they need, so you're not worried about that, but that's how it started. And then we got even more interested and started looking at material properties and absorptions. And we can see we even try to see if miniskirts are better than bikinis or not in reverberant spaces. So that's how curious we are. So, okay, I want to also talk about what I learned at Karma. One afternoon I was talking with Julius Smith, and he said something that really struck me, like rooms are just filters. So I got very interested in filters. The big question is, how does our brain process these filters? Could it be that these weird frequency holes and peaks actually contribute to the way we feel awe, mystery, or tension in a space? So we want to look at our perception.
Hair cells inside the cochlea ride these waves, and the hair bundles are moved.
Okay, sorry.
The hair bundle on top of the hair.
Oh, I should have muted the sound. But the video is important. Let me see if I can mute it here. Yes. So it turns out that rooms can actually behave like comb filters. What does that mean? A comb filter is created when a sound mixes with a delayed version of itself. This causes a pattern of constructive and deconstructive interferences in the frequency domain. Some parts of the sounds get louder and other gets canceled. So how do these interference affect our perception? They pass through our auditory system, where the sound waves are transformed into electrical signals. These signals cause neurons to fire in specific patterns and activate different parts of the brain related to sound, memory, and emotion. And somehow it can create a feeling of joy. So something people sometimes call a spiritual bliss, especially in moments of transcendence. These are some of the key references that have guided my research. Keltner laid the foundation by defining awe as a moral, spiritual, and aesthetic emotion, and that was one of the very, I would say, informative and influential works that I read, which defines this awe scale. Their goal was to create a strong and reliable tool to measure the emotion and cognitive and physical parts of awe. They found 6 key dimensions, things like changes in time perception or intense physical sensation like chills. And they tested this in 2 big studies. In the first one, participants were asked to write about a personal awe experience and then rate it using a list of 61 questions. After analyzing the data using something called exploratory factor analysis, they found 6 clear dimensions and created a refined 30-item scale, what we now call awe scale. Each part of the scale showed strong internal consistency. So this is basically, I think, the most rigorous work that we have seen so far. But why measuring eye is so tricky? It's tricky for me. I mean, Allah has expanded my vision today, but my research have tried to measure up, but most of the time, many researchers have tried to measure up, but most of the time they miss something important. Some studies ask people to remember a past or experience, and others show videos of big nature scenes or mountains, or even 2D and VR videos are used. But even with VR, it's still just watching a video. It's not the same as really being there, you know. The problem is these methods usually don't include all the 6 key parts of awe, like feeling small, time distortion, or strong physical sensations. So they cannot truly recreate awe in a way that is deep enough to measure or study them scientifically. Effects of experiencing awe. This is about the study that some of other studies that I think have like similar issue, but they basically verify that it helps well-being, or there is this time distortion element. So this is a recent study by our Karma colleagues, Maurice and Tokakov, and it's a very close project to the work I'm doing. And they basically tested how different room acoustics in VR affect both immersion and musical behavior. So participants performed music in a dry and reverberant visual spaces. Reverberant spaces felt much more immersive. 81% preferred them. Interestingly, people played with more timing variation, but more consistent intensity in reverberant spaces. So overall, this study shows that room acoustics don't just shape how we feel, they actually change how we act. The other example is the one that Alok mentioned already, and is a very rigorous study on how acoustic characteristics of space can affect emotional experience. And I think she talked about them, so I'm not gonna repeat, and hopefully I'm not getting wrong conclusions. So I am skipping this slide, hoping that you know about the findings. Then what are the measuring tools so far that different research projects have been using? All scale is one of the most used ones. IAT is something that we are exploring, implicit association test, because I think feeling awe is mostly a subconscious phenomena, and things like self-report questionnaire and I don't know, awe scale might not reflect exactly what we need to understand here. But physiological measures are definitely useful, and we are planning to use them in our study. Another method we use, a little bit more about implicit association test. I don't know if maybe you're familiar with it, but I was not before. It's basically a post-stimulus measurement that helps us go beyond self-report by tracking subconscious association. For example, the self-diminishment IAT shows whether people associate themselves more with words like small or vast after an awe experience. And the time perception IAT looks at whether people process time as moving slower or faster, a common effect reported during awe. These are valuable because awe is often hard to put into words, and IAT help us catch the hidden automatic shift in perception that people may not be aware of. I don't know, this is a dangerous test. I don't want to like take it, but it is informing, I think. It shows how this works. Oh, I have to change my audio.
Begin, you're asked to sort the faces as quickly as possible. If you see a white face, hit a key to your left. If you see a black face, hit a key to your right. Next, you sort words that represent two attitudinal categories, good and bad. When you see a good word such as beauty, hit a key to your left. When you see a bad word such as filth, hit a key to your right. Now the real challenge starts. You're instructed to sort both photos and words, whatever flashes on the screen. For some runs, you are instructed to press the same key for white faces and good words, say on your left, and a different same key for black faces and bad words, say on your right. If you have a more positive association with white folks as compared to black folks, then in this particular arrangement, you will find your groove and fly through the test. Most of us do. But on other runs, which are randomized and counterbalanced, the IAT will give you different directions. Press the same key for white faces and bad words, and another same key for black faces and good words.
Anyway,
in these
this
runs,
is basically the framework or how it works, and there is ways to apply this for auditory experiences. So we are looking at designing that for our study. I think this slide summarizes the different methods that we want to use for measuring the impact of all. For example, a thin slice can help us to capture that transitional moment from one state to another state. And I talked about the rest. So what are the main challenges in this study? The challenge is not just to trigger up, but to do it in a way that fits in a controlled psychoacoustics experiment. We want to understand the subconscious brain processes behind not just what people say they feel, but what's really happening neurologically. That means we have to carefully design an awe-inducing experience inside the lab, something powerful but also measurable. We also need to separate the sound from other factors like visuals or memories to see what sound alone can do. And it's a delicate balance between emotional impact and scientific control. So in the beginning, we focused on simple virtual room geometries like tall rooms, domed rooms, coupled spaces, to study how acoustical features like echo density and spatial diffusion or reverberation time that are affected by geometry can affect our perception. Well, the common element between all these spaces was the vastness of them. This was one of our preliminary steps towards understanding this. rationale. Okay, what's the rationale of current state of a pilot? This is our latest scheme. Basically, is based on the idea that acoustics can play a central role in triggering awe. We know that awe involves vastness and self-diminishment, and previous studies shows that reverberation and diffusion affect how large a space feels even more than actual size. There is also evidence that sound alone can stretch our sense of time, similar to how vast visuals do. And when it comes to music, features like harmonic richness, slow builds up, and a spatial reverberation seems to enhance awe, especially when combined with VR. This is the foundation we're using to shape our experimental design. At this, I'm trying to summarize and get to the current state of our research. So eventually we decided to choose three real spaces with different sizes, but all commonly agreed as awe-inducing spaces. So, but with different volume sizes and different reverberation time, because that's the more obvious way to like categorize and separate these rooms. These are the three rooms we chose. One of the Chauvet Cave galleries, Jame Mosque in Isfahan, and Hagia Sophia. We love Hagia Sophia, right? And that was the start. And for example, to like look at the impact of diffusion and geometry, we studied the same, like similar volume, but in a shoebox form to just like see the impact of you know, the geometry and the ornamentation and all the refinements of form, as opposed to a very simple raw cubical space that creates a lot of specular reflections. So that was our strategy. So we basically created all these like variations for diffused and specular spaces in different with different reverberation times, and it created all these like trials that some include audio only, some are audio only, some are visual only, and some are audio visual, so we can see the effect of each part and look at the effect of combined or multi-sensory experience together. Let me see if I can show you this. How much time? Oh, I have a lot of time. Let me, these are the audio only versions, but I'm just gonna show you the audio visual versions. This is just a very like draft sketch of what we have in mind. Can I make this louder? Anyway, there are some like audio only parts, and we have audio visual parts, some segments with no reverberation and some segments with reverberation, so we can see the differences. And we have used like similar sound stimulus to see how they are different in different. I'm sorry, I was playing two of them at the same time. So this is the dry version. And then further on, we chose like relevant musical excerpts for each of these spaces. Yep. Let me go back to my presentation. What was my main finding, I would say, is this slide. I think I found that cinema is one of the most helpful art forms to guide the structure of our experiment. So that these like experiments that we are designing are like they all have like a cinematic arc, starting with an introduction, followed by a contrast and climax, and ending with a soft landing. So I worked closely on the cinematography and sound design to make sure the narrative flow and perception of sound go hand in hand. Each section was carefully designed to help participants become more emotionally and sonically open. Also, we created a rhythmic sequence of audio-only, visual-only, and combined audiovisual parts, which allows us to separate the effect of each medium on perception, but in a way that still feels natural inside the storyline. Do I have time for this? Like, I don't. May I show this video? It's the end of the, yeah? Thank you. So
no one's going to get to ask you any questions, but you can show us.
No, I don't answer any questions.
Hello there. Thank you for being here today. Your participation means a lot, and we're grateful you've taken this moment out of your day. You're about to be part of a short, immersive experience. This project is part of ongoing research to better understand how we respond to rich, emotionally engaging environments. There are no right or wrong ways to feel, just your honest experience. Before we begin, let's take a moment to settle. Gently release the noise of the outside world. Focus on your breath and simply listen. Gently close your eyes and bring your attention to the breath. Breathing in, feel the body expand. Breathing out, feel it soften and settle. Let each breath anchor you here, creating space within for what's about to unfold.
is early morning in Isfahan Bazaar. It's the pre-exposure part of the experiment that you're basically getting to the context of the awe-inducing moment. So in this part, you are basically staying at the center of the
Now, when we explore the objects and instruments in front of you to create sound, you're also welcome to use your voice gently.
Not great for speech intelligibility, but basically the narrator is asking, inviting people to interact with the space because we're using Caviar, the virtual acoustic system, in parallel with the ambisonic playback of what we heard. Yeah, I don't know still how we're going to measure that, but interaction is also a possibility. And this was my first attempt to kind of create that cinematic arc I was talking
about. And now we'll take a moment to reflect with a few questions. This helps us better understand how the experience may have shaped your thoughts, feelings, or sense of presence. Take a breath and answer from your...
So then there is the questionnaire and all those kind of things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. And if you have some questions for Nima, I encourage you to find Nima during the coffee break, which we're going to do now because we're a little over. But let's, we were supposed to be back here at 3:15, but now why don't we say we'll come back here at 3:25, give ourselves a good little chance to stretch our legs, and there's some coffee and snacks there in the lobby. So back here at 3:25 for the discussion.
May I just make a complaint? I really want to answer questions,